The Quad Cities, where 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 4. Fall asleep to Hilarious History. Copyright 2026, James Henderson. To the reader, it has long been a source of profound bewilderment to me that humanity, in its infinite capacity for confusion, settled upon the banks of the Mississippi River and decided that a sensible way to organize a civilization was to take 4 cities, which are, by any honest count of rooftops and tax levies, 5, and call them the Quad Cities. It is a mathematical achievement that would make a tax auditor weep into his ledger and a geometry professor retire to a monastery. I have spent a respectable amount of time among these people. I have watched them debate the structural integrity of a pizza crust with the gravity usually reserved for the ratification of a peace treaty. I have seen them stand on a bridge, staring at the water, and argue over whether they are in Iowa or Illinois, as if the river cared a fig for the imaginary lines drawn by men who had never seen the place. They are a stubborn industrial lot, residing in a corner of the globe where they insist on calling themselves the Silicon Valley of Guns, because they have more milling machines than the rest of the country has sense, and they hold on to their .45s with the same spiritual fervor a drowning man holds on to a life preserver. This book is an attempt, perhaps a futile one, to put some semblance of order to this delightful anarchy. Here you will find the truth, or at least the version of the truth that survived the telling, of how we turned the prairie into an engine room, how we elevated the eating of shredded malt dough into a high art, and why, if you ask a local for directions, you are likely to be told that the best way to get to where you want to go is to not have started where you did. It is a history of the region that refuses to be defined by maps, names, or the basic laws of arithmetic. It is a story of plow makers, aluminum smiths, and men who looked at a perfectly good pizza and decided it needed a salad on top of it. If you find these pages offensive, you are likely a cartographer or a proponent of sensible city planning. If you find them amusing, you are a soul after my own heart. I have endeavored to tell the tale with as much accuracy as the local legends would permit, which is to say very little indeed. Read on if you must, and try to keep your footing. The river is rising, the pizza is cooling, and there is no telling what those fellows in Geneseo are going to invent next. Your humble narrator, Mark Twain. Chapter 1. The Geography of Disagreement. The Mississippi River is a creature of immense vanity, but in the vicinity of the Quad Cities, it suffers a temporary lapse of direction that has been the ruin of many a sober cartographer. Throughout its long, muddy trek from the headwaters of Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, the great river behaves itself with the predictable north to south solemnity of a funeral procession. Yet, upon arriving at the border of Iowa and Illinois, it decides to engage in a peculiar, crab-like shuffle toward the west. It is here that the river, perhaps struck by a sudden desire to view the sunset in a more leisurely fashion, decides to flow horizontally. This geographical whim has had the most unfortunate consequences for the local citizenry. It has fostered a population that is permanently confused about which direction is up or down, and has left them with the distinct impression that they inhabit a place where the laws of nature and, by extension, the laws of municipal common sense are merely suggestions. It is in this bend, where the river performs its aquatic gymnastics, that we find a collection of settlements so bafflingly organized that it defies the very essence of arithmetic. The region is known as the Quad Cities. One might reasonably assume, given the prefix, that this moniker implies the presence of four distinct municipal entities. A stranger arriving in town with a calculator and a penchant for honesty will soon find himself in a state of nervous collapse, for there are, by any rigorous count of mayors, city councils, and tax collectors, 5 of them: Davenport, Bettendorf, Rock Island, Moline, and the ever-elusive East Moline. To call them the Quad Cities is a piece of American fiction sustained with the same vigorous, trembling devotion that a small boy reserves for the existence of Santa Claus. If one were to stand in a public house in Davenport and suggest that, on account of there being 5 cities, the name might be rendered a trifle inaccurate, one would be met with the cold, pitying gaze usually reserved for a man who has attempted to butter his toast with a fountain pen. It is a local tradition to pretend that East Moline is merely a very persistent suburb, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by excessive exposure to river fog, rather than an entire city that stubbornly refuses to vacate the map. This municipal identity crisis is merely the start of the local peculiarities. The Quad Cities occupy a position of industrial prominence that is entirely disproportionate to their size, largely because the locals have an unshakable conviction that they can manufacture anything, provided it is made of iron, steel, or sheer stubbornness. Travel a few miles to the east, into the prairie-fringed hamlet of Geneseo, and you will find the Silicon Valley of Guns. It is a title that captures the absurdity of our age perfectly, while the genuine Silicon Valley in California busies itself with the creation of ephemeral software and apps that remind one to drink water. Geneseo has opted for the more tactile business of milling steel into objects that operate with a terrifying degree of precision. It is a place where innovation means ensuring the slide of a .45 caliber pistol racks with the smoothness of a well-oiled secret. They look upon the world of digital circuitry with a suspicion that borders on the theological, preferring the honest mechanical clatter of a hammer striking a pin to the invisible, humming magic of a microchip. And then, of course, there is the matter of the local diet, which is governed by a culinary philosophy that can only be described as aggressively peculiar. The region is famous for a pizza that is so fundamentally different from anything found in the civilized world that it requires a guide, a lecture, and possibly a lawyer to consume. It is a pizza built upon a crust infused with malt, a substance that gives it the nutty, sweet, and somewhat suspicious profile of a breakfast cereal that has gone to seed. The sauce is so aggressively spicy it could serve as a prophylactic against most known diseases, and the toppings are buried beneath a blanket of mozzarella, as if the cook were embarrassed by them. Most unsettling of all, this concoction is never sliced into sensible, manageable triangles. No, that would be too easy. It is cut into long, narrow strips, which one is expected to manipulate with the manual dexterity of a surgeon. I once observed a man from the East attempt to eat a slice of this pizza with a fork. He was, within minutes, escorted from the premises by a local gentleman of substantial girth, who informed him that such behavior was not merely a violation of local custom, but a borderline felony. This, then, is our home. It is a place of industrial cathedrals, where we cast the aluminum bones of great airplanes, and of riverside parks where eagles watch us with a cold, detached judgment. It is a place where we honor jazz legends by running marathons in the sweltering July heat, and where we treat the II-74 bridge as a sort of purgatory designed to test the limits of human patience. It is a region that refuses to be defined by maps, names, or the basic laws of arithmetic. It is, in short, a place that is entirely, stubbornly, and gloriously itself. So, traveler, settle in. We shall explore these 5 cities that pretend to be 4, this steel-plated heartland that pretends to be a tech hub, and this pizza that pretends to be food. But do be careful where you walk. The river is rising, the pizza is cooling, and there is no telling what those fellows in Geneseo are going to invent next. We are, after all, in the Quad Cities, where the only thing we know for certain is that 2 + 2 equals whatever the city council decides it should be, and heaven help the man who brings a calculator to the debate. Chapter 2. The Battle of the Malt Crust, Harris versus Happy Joe's. If you wish to truly understand the character of the Quad Cities, you must not look to our bridges, nor our factories, nor even that bizarre industrial hub of Geneseo, where men treat gun-making as a high-minded religious vocation. No, you must look to the dinner table. It is here, amidst the steam of malt-infused dough and the dangerous allure of shredded toppings, that the true battles of our civilization are fought. For in this river valley, pizza is not merely a supper. It is a theological position, a rallying cry, and a source of municipal schism that has fractured families more effectively than any political disagreement could ever hope to manage. There are 2 great churches in this land. The first is the Church of Harris, a place of stoic, traditional devotion, where the sauce is applied with the disciplined hand of a master painter, and the crust holds the integrity of a well-fortified bridge. The second is the Church of Happy Joe's, a populist movement founded upon the principle that a pizza should be a cheerful, inclusive event, and that if you cannot find joy in a pizza cut into strips, then you are a man of profound and lamentable sadness. To walk into a Harris establishment is to step into a sanctuary of serious business. One does not arrive at Harris expecting frivolity. One arrives to partake in a tradition that smells of history and garlic. The practitioners here believe that a pizza is a thing of structure. The crust is thin. The malt is subtle, a mere suggestion of sweetness that plays against the sharp, metallic tang of the sausage. And the cheese is laid down with a heavy, uncompromising hand. It is a pizza for the contemplative man, the man who wants to sit in a booth with his elbows planted firmly on the table and consider the state of his industry while chewing on a slice that offers a sturdy, dependable resistance to the tooth. Across the great divide, which is usually measured in miles but feels more like the distance between 2 opposing planets, sits the empire of Happy Joe's. It is a place of bright lights, infectious smiles, and the occasional burst of genuine, unadulterated whimsy. The Happy Joe's disciple treats the pizza as a gateway to a better, kinder world. Here, the cheese is plentiful, the atmosphere is loud, and the staff carries themselves with the weary, patient kindness of those who have seen the full range of human hunger and met it with a platter of dough. It is, to the outsider, a place of chaotic pleasure. To the local, it is the home of the Happy Joe's Special, a creation so laden with ingredients that one must approach it with the caution of a man dismantling an unexploded ordnance. The friction between these two factions is a marvel to behold. I have seen perfectly amicable neighbors descend into a state of frosty silence simply because one suggested a Friday night outing to Harris, while the other was yearning for the festive clutter of a Happy Joe's. It is a civil war fought with napkins and soda straws. The Harris loyalists will tell you that Happy Joe's is a place for children and tourists, a soft, frivolous establishment that lacks the backbone of true pizza craft. The Happy Joe's advocates, in turn, will look at the Harris pizza and declare it a joyless, austere artifact, a thing designed for men who find comfort in drab colors and predictable outcomes. And then, just as the populace was adjusting to this binary struggle, there arrived the great calamity. It was not a famine, nor a flood, nor a collapse of the local economy. It was, in fact, a culinary invention so profound, so deeply misguided, and so utterly persistent that it deserves its own chapter in the annals of human folly. I speak, of course, of the taco pizza. It began, I suspect, as a lark. Some local genius, perhaps emboldened by a surfeit of salsa and an excess of imagination, decided that the malt crust was not a boundary to be respected, but a platform to be colonized. They took the sturdy, dependable architecture of the Quad Cities pie and proceeded to dump a garden's worth of shredded lettuce, a mountain of crushed tortilla chips, and a deluge of spicy salsa upon the cheese. It was an act of madness. It was a chaotic, soggy, and profoundly illogical affront to every rule of culinary decorum. And yet the public embraced it with the fervor of a starving congregation discovering a new, albeit highly irregular gospel. The taco pizza tragedy, as I have come to call it, transformed our local pizza war into a three-ring circus of indigestion. Harris had to adapt, lest they be left behind in the dust of the taco-flavored future. Happy Joe's leaned into the absurdity, refining the taco concoction until it became the flagship of their fleet, a monstrosity that challenged the very definition of what a pizza should be. To consume a taco pizza is to engage in a struggle for survival. The lettuce wilts instantly under the heat of the sauce, the chips crumble into a gritty, confusing paste, and the entire structure slides off the malt crust with the graceful, unceremonious haste of an avalanche. One eats a taco pizza, not for the pleasure of the experience, but for the thrill of the endurance test. You pick up a strip, you attempt to balance the crumbling chips, you navigate the sliding debris of lettuce and meat, and you hope, against all logic, that you can reach your mouth before the whole thing disintegrates into a sad, lukewarm heap on your lap. It is a testament to the local character that we do not merely tolerate this, we demand it. We have elevated the taco pizza to the status of a regional mascot, an edible representation of our own refusal to be bound by the expectations of the rest of the world. There are those who would call this a tragedy, and indeed, I have spent many a sleepless night contemplating the philosophical implications of a pizza that requires a side of salsa for dipping. But as I look out over the river, watching the barges push their heavy loads southward, I am struck by a thought. Perhaps the taco pizza is the perfect symbol for the Quad Cities. It is a glorious, messy, contradictory collision of cultures and ingredients that has no business being together, yet somehow manages to hold its own against the weight of tradition. We are a people who prefer our crusts with malt, our pizzas with strips, and our culinary identity in a constant state of mild, delicious panic. We do not want your simple, round, sliced-in triangles pies. We do not want your adherence to the standard laws of gastronomy. We want the malt, we want the chaos, and if we occasionally feel the need to pile a salad on top of our dinner and call it a breakthrough, then that is our right as residents of this river-swept, bridge-crossed, pizza-obsessed patch of the world. So, let the wars rage on. Let the Harris loyalists hold their ground, and let the Happy Joe's believers keep their lights bright and their toppings abundant. As for me, I shall sit in my booth, armed with my fork and my sense of irony, and wait to see what manner of culinary catastrophe they decide to invent next. For in the Quad Cities, the only thing more certain than the river's path is the fact that if you give us a perfectly good meal, we will find a way to make it twice as complicated, thrice as messy, and entirely, unmistakably, our own. Chapter 3. The Silicon Valley of Guns. It has often been remarked by those who possess a suspicious amount of leisure time that the modern world is drifting toward a horizon defined by silicon fiber optic threads, and the sort of ethereal cloud-based existence where a man might lose his entire library if he forgets a password. We are told that the future belongs to the coders, the data miners, and the young men in hooded sweatshirts who spend their afternoons teaching machines how to behave like slightly less annoying humans. But if one wishes to find the real future, the sort of future that does not vanish when the power fails, but instead maintains a very consistent, steel-to-the-metal reliability, one must forego the air-conditioned lounges of the coasts and take a train to Geneseo, Illinois. In Geneseo, the talk is not of bandwidth, disruption, or user experience. The talk is of tolerances, of hammer-forged barrels, of feed ramps and sear engagement. They have, with that peculiar Midwestern blend of humility and unshakable arrogance, dubbed themselves the Silicon Valley of Guns. It is a title that should, by any reasonable standard, provoke a riot of laughter. One thinks of Silicon Valley and envisions a sea of expensive coffee, yoga mats, and venture capital, whereas one thinks of Geneseo and envisions a place where the air is thick with the scent of gun oil, coal smoke, and the sound of a milling machine doing the Lord's work. Yet the comparison is apt in one vital, ironclad particular. It is a place where a small knot of humanity has decided that they shall be the masters of a specific high-tech craft, and woe betide anyone who suggests that their brand of engineering is any less miraculous than a microchip. To enter the workshops of Geneseo is to step into a cathedral of the mechanical. Here, the holy objects are not circuit boards, but blocks of steel, and the high priests are men who can detect a deviation of a 10,000th of an inch with a touch of the finger. It is a world of rigid, unforgiving mathematics made manifest in hardened blue-black metal. In the true Silicon Valley, an error in judgment might result in a computer program that fails to load or an app that crashes upon launch. In Geneseo, an error in judgment results in a piece of machinery that simply refuses to perform its duties, which in these parts is considered a form of moral failing comparable to cowardice in the face of the enemy. There is a sort of religious reverence for the .45 caliber handgun that permeates the very masonry of the town. To the Geneseo craftsman, this particular firearm is not merely a device of utility, it is a masterpiece of historical evolution, a lineage of steel that reaches back to the days when a man's survival depended on the speed of his draw and the weight of his lead. They speak of it with the hushed, affectionate tones that a sculptor might use to describe his marble. They know its inner architecture as a parent knows the temperament of a child. They know why the spring must be of a certain tension, why the ramp must be polished until it shines like a mirror, and why the slide must move with a crisp, resonant clack that signals a mechanical perfection that is as satisfying as a well-delivered punchline. The humor in all this, and there is a great deal of it for those who care to look, lies in the utter indifference the Geneseo man holds for the digital revolution. He is aware that the world beyond the cornfields is busy digitizing itself into oblivion. He knows that his neighbors in other parts of the country are buying smart devices that can tell them the weather, the stock market, and the exact caloric content of their breakfast. He simply does not care. He would much rather spend his afternoon perfecting the trigger pull on a slide that will still be functioning long after the last server in Palo Alto has been melted down for scrap. There is a profound stoic comfort in a machine that requires no software updates, no Wi-Fi connectivity, and no subscription to a cloud-based service in order to operate. One finds, upon closer inspection, that the Geneseo factory floor is a place of curious, old-fashioned industry. There is a rhythm to it, a percussion of stamping, the hum of lathes, the steady, rhythmic breathing of men who have traded the uncertainty of the office for the absolute truth of the machine tool. They are, in a very real sense, the last of the alchemists. They take the raw, stubborn earth, the iron ore, the carbon, the nickel, and through the application of heat and geometry, they transmute it into a form of precision that is as reliable as the rising of the sun. It is a craft that rewards patience, punishes carelessness, and demands a level of focus that would make a modern executive's head spin with vertigo. Of course, the outsiders, the lobbyists, the politicians, the wide-eyed journalists from the East come to Geneseo expecting to find something terrifying. They arrive with their preconceived notions of tactical environments and industrial armories, expecting to be greeted by men in fatigues and grim, silent guards. What they find instead is a collection of folks who look remarkably like the people who run the grain elevator down the road, and who are just as likely to ask you, if you've had lunch as they are, to show you a blueprint for a new frame. It is the great, quiet joke of the Valley of the Trigger. They have cornered the market on a product that makes the rest of the world sit up and take notice, and they do it while eating a ham sandwich and complaining about the state of the road construction on the highway. It is a culture of supreme confidence. They know that what they build is good. They know that when a man picks up a piece of their work, he is holding a fragment of the heartland that is as honest, as heavy, and as unpretentious as the corn that grows on the surrounding plains. They don't need the validation of the coastal tech hubs because they are busy forging the reality that exists underneath all that digital nonsense. When the sun sets over Geneseo, casting long purple shadows across the factory roofs, and the machines are finally silenced, there is a profound quiet that settles over the town. It is a quiet that respects the work. There is no humming of servers here, no blinking of status lights, no frantic pinging of notifications. There is only the settling of the iron and the stillness of a place that knows its own value. They have created a Silicon Valley that operates on the laws of physics rather than the whims of shareholders. And while they may never achieve the frantic, breathless acclaim of the software kings, they have something far more valuable. They have a machine that works, a town that produces, and a pride that is as solid and unyielding as the steel they cast in their foundries. And really, in a world that is becoming increasingly ephemeral, there is something to be said for a man who can hold his work in his hand and know with absolute certainty that it will not crash. Chapter 4. The Alcoa / Arconic Aluminum Cathedral. If one possesses a desire to see the modern world stripped of its pretensions and reduced to its shiny, metallic essentials, one ought to make a pilgrimage to the riverfront in Bettendorf. There stands the Alcoa, or Arconic, as the boardroom wizards have seen fit to rechristen it, a colossal, sprawling monument to the sheer, stubborn audacity of the 20th century. It is a place that turned the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust from a laboratory curiosity, once used by Napoleon III to impress his dinner guests, into the very skeleton of the civilization that now struts, flies, and scurries across the globe. To behold this plant is to realize that the age of information is a thin, gossamer veil. Beneath the apps and the fiber optics and the digital noise lies a foundation of cold, hard rolled aluminum. It is a cathedral dedicated not to saints, but to the process of crushing rocks until they yield their secret silver heart. It is the industrial engine that provided the skin for every flying machine that has ever dared to defy the gravity of the Mississippi Valley, a factory that consumes electricity with the gluttony of a medium-sized sun and returns the favor by spitting out sheets of metal so thin they seem to defy the laws of material reality. The men and women who work these halls have a relationship with aluminum that is difficult for the average desk-bound citizen to fathom. They do not merely operate machinery. They commune with a temperamental, shimmering beast. They speak of the fizz and the melt with the same hushed, superstitious respect that a sailor might accord the temper of the North Atlantic. They have learned that if you treat the metal with the right amount of force, the right degree of heat, and the right measure of stubbornness, it will do anything you ask. It will become a soda can to hold your fizz, a girder to hold your office building, or the wing of a jet that will carry you halfway around the world while you sleep in a state of mild, air-conditioned indifference. There is a peculiar ringing music to the Arconic plant, a constant rhythmic thunder that rattles the very fillings in one's teeth and insists that the reader understand the magnitude of the endeavor. It is the sound of the rolling mills, where great slab-like ingots of aluminum are subjected to the indignity of being squashed between immense steel rollers until they have no choice but to surrender and become as flat as a politician's promise. One watches this process and is overcome by a sense of profound vertigo. Here is a substance that was pulled from the red, muddy clay of the tropics, shipped across oceans, and here, in the heart of the Midwest, it is being forced into the precise aerodynamic curves of the future. It is a transformation of such violence and grace that one cannot help but stand in silence and offer a nod of respect to the sheer, unvarnished power of the thing. It is a curious fact of our local geography that we should have become the world's leading purveyor of lightness. We are, as a people, of the earth, sturdy, grounded, and possessed of a healthy skepticism toward anything that floats too high in the air. Yet our fortunes are built upon the manufacturing of things meant to minimize weight. We have perfected the art of the featherlight, the aerodynamic, and the fleeting. We spend our days obsessing over the reduction of ounces, stripping away every superfluous atom, all to save a few pennies in fuel that no passenger in the rear of the cabin will ever notice or appreciate. It is a pursuit of a sublime metallic perfection that borders on the ascetic, a monk-like devotion to the reduction of mass. The irony, of course, is that the plant itself is the very definition of heavy. It is an anchor of gargantuan proportions, a structure of steel and concrete that has sat upon the riverbank for so many decades that the very earth seems to have sighed and accepted its permanence. It is the contrast that is most delightful to the observing mind. A behemoth of industry rooted deep in the Iowa soil, busily turning out the materials that allow the rest of humanity to drift above the clouds. It is a factory that has seen the rise and fall of industrial fashions, the shifting of corporate names, and the changing of global loyalties. Yet it remains, like the river that feeds it, a constant, churning, indispensable presence. One cannot help but admire the sheer defiant longevity of the place. It has survived the era of the giant soaring passenger airships. It has outlived the age of the great boxy automobiles that were draped in heavy decorative chrome, and it has adapted to the era of the high-speed, computer-guided engine. It has been the target of countless government regulations, the subject of unending corporate mergers, and the heartbeat of a community that has tied its very existence to the rolling of the metal. If the Quad Cities were a human character in a tall tale, the Arconic plant would be the sturdy, silent smithy who stands in the corner, hammering out the gear for the heroes, expecting neither thanks nor glory, merely the satisfaction of a job performed with the precision of a master. And then there are the stories told in the taverns after the shifts change, the legends of the superalloys, the metals forged for secret, high-altitude projects that no one is allowed to name, and the tales of the great shutdowns when the machinery goes silent and the plant seems to hold its breath like a dormant volcano. It is in these moments of silence that one realizes just how much of the modern world's infrastructure is merely a pale, thin reflection of what is happening inside those halls. We are all living in a house of aluminum, whether we acknowledge it or not. From the window frame that holds back the wind to the engine that powers the world's commerce, we are the beneficiaries of the Bettendorf melt. It is, perhaps, a fitting tribute to our region that we should be the home of such a thing. We are a place that hides its importance behind a mask of Midwestern modesty. We are the place that makes the things that make the world go, yet we do so without the fanfare of the coastal capitals. We prefer to do the work, collect our wages, and go home to our malt crust pizza and our quiet evenings by the river, leaving the rest of the world to marvel at the flight of the machines we have enabled, without ever once wondering where the wings were born. So, let the scientists in their laboratories dream of new materials, and let the entrepreneurs in their boardrooms fret over their quarterly returns. The Arconic plant will continue to do what it has always done. It will take the stubborn red earth, it will apply the thunder of the rolling mills, and it will churn out the shiny silver bones of the world. It is the great, roaring secret of the riverfront, the beating metallic heart of the Quad Cities, and if you listen closely enough on a quiet night, you can almost hear the rhythm of the rollers, whispering the story of a valley that decided to give the world wings and then went back to work, without a word of complaint. It is a grand, shimmering comedy of materials, and we are quite happily its sole and secret keepers. Chapter 5. The Arsenal's Iron Grasp. To traverse the bridge from the mainland of the Quad Cities onto Rock Island is to participate in a ritual of geographic confusion that would be laughable were it not so profoundly solemn. You leave the bustling, pizza-scented streets of the cities, where the most pressing concern is whether a local establishment uses a sufficiently aged malt in its dough, and you enter a domain that exists in a state of suspended reality. It is a government-operated island, a place where the trees seem to grow in straight, orderly lines, as if they were drafted by a committee, and the squirrels possess a military bearing that suggests they have been vetted for security clearances. The arsenal, as it is called by those who wish to sound as if they know where the secrets are buried, is a military facility of such staggering contradiction that I am surprised it does not simply fold in upon itself like a poorly constructed omelet. It is the nation's largest government-operated arsenal, a vast, sprawling complex that has been churning out the instruments of national defense since the days when the country was still trying to decide if it was one nation or a collection of temperamental siblings. And yet, if you were to wander through it on a pleasant Sunday afternoon, you would be forgiven for mistaking it for a municipal park designed by a man who had a great fondness for high-security fencing and gravel paths. It is a place where history is kept under glass, or, more accurately, under the watchful eye of a man in a booth who has been instructed to ask you for your papers with the enthusiasm of a tax collector on a Monday morning. There are cemeteries here, hallowed, quiet, and immaculately groomed, where the ghosts of the Civil War rest beneath white stones that stretch across the landscape like a field of frozen, silent teeth. It is a sobering experience, a necessary reminder that the iron we forge in our foundries is not merely for the building of tractors or the creation of high-speed transit. It is also for the darker, grimmer business of settling arguments that have gone on far too long. But then, you turn a corner and you are confronted with the industrial reality of the place. You see the workshops, the testing grounds, the vast, echoing halls where the machinery hums with the same industrial purpose as the foundries of Bettendorf or the smithies of Geneseo. It is an island that keeps its own counsel. It has seen the Blackhawk War. It has served as a prison for the men who lost their way in the great catastrophe of the 1860s, and it has emerged as a powerhouse of logistical might. Yet it does so with a sort of secretive, buttoned-up efficiency that makes the surrounding cities look like a collection of noisy, gossiping children. There is a peculiar humor to be found in the arsenal's relationship with the rest of the Quad Cities. We live in its shadow, we drive past its gates every day, and we go about our business of eating shredded pizza and arguing over whether East Moline actually exists, all while the island sits there, silent and watchful, like a stern military uncle who refuses to say anything at the dinner table. It is a constant looming presence, a place where the destiny of the Republic is occasionally hammered into shape behind closed doors. And yet, for the average citizen, it is mostly a beautiful, overgrown place to avoid getting a speeding ticket while driving through the scenic routes. I often find myself wondering what the inhabitants of the island make of us. Do they look across the water at the smokestacks of Arconic and the silos of John Deere and think to themselves, "Look at these industrious pizza-devouring fools churning out the things of peace while we hold the keys to the things of war?" Or do they perhaps envy us our freedom to miscount our own cities and debate the merits of malt crust dough? There is a certain detached dignity to the island that the rest of us entirely lack. We are a collection of neighborhoods, districts, and municipalities that are constantly spilling over into one another, whereas the arsenal is a fixed, immutable fact of the landscape. It is the anchor that holds the Quad Cities from drifting entirely into the abyss of our own civic nonsense. The history of the island is a tapestry of high drama and low comedy. There was the time, long ago, when the island was a neutral ground, a place where the indigenous tribes and the arriving settlers tried to figure out who belonged to which patch of soil, a conversation that, as is the habit of mankind, tended to involve more muskets than dialogue. There was the era when the government decided that this was the perfect place to store the nation's supply of powder, a decision that essentially turned the island into a giant ticking clock of potential disaster. One can only imagine the nerves of the men who worked there, knowing that a single, poorly aimed lightning bolt or a careless smoker could turn the entire Quad Cities into a very impressive, temporary constellation. And then there are the stories of the inmates of the prison camp during the Civil War. It is said that the winters were brutal, that the river was a sheet of iron, and that the men trapped there looked across the water at the lights of Davenport and dreamed of a life that did not involve hunger or cold. It is a history that hangs heavy in the air, a reminder that the land we now use for parades and historical tours was once a place of profound misery. It is the strange, contradictory nature of the arsenal. It is a place of life and death, of industry and silence, of the grand, sweeping narrative of the nation and the small personal stories of the men who stood watch. I confess, I have a fondness for the place despite its bureaucratic, prickly nature. It is the only place in the region that does not feel the need to justify its existence by calling itself a Quad City. It does not care about the pizza wars, it does not care about the Tri-City Delusion, and it certainly does not care about the Silicon Valley of guns. It simply is. It is a rock in the river, a sentinel of steel, a place where the law of the land is replaced by the law of the Department of Defense, and it holds its position with a silent, ironclad resolve that is quite refreshing. To visit the arsenal is to see the Quad Cities from the outside in. You look back at the shoreline, at the homes, the storefronts, the grain elevators, and you see a collection of human effort that seems remarkably fragile against the backdrop of the great wide river. You see the industry that fuels the local engine, you see the sprawl of the housing developments, and you see the chaotic, beautiful mess of a region that is trying to be four things at once. It is a perspective that the rest of us rarely achieve because we are too busy being inside the mess. So let us raise a glass to the island, the silent, watchful, heavily armed uncle of the Quad Cities. Let us appreciate the way it sits in the middle of our great sideways flowing river, a reminder that underneath our pizza stripping and our bridge crossing and our industrial pride, there is a core of something harder, something older, and something entirely unconcerned with whether or not we can manage the simple arithmetic of adding 5 to 4. The arsenal is the heavy hand that keeps the region anchored, and heaven knows, with as much as we love to drift, we probably need it more than we are ever willing to admit. It is, perhaps, the most important part of our local story, the part that says, we may be a collection of confused, hungry, and overly industrious fools, but we are a confusion that is held in place by the most impressive set of fences in the state. And really, is that not the hallmark of a true American home? Chapter 6. The Gospel of the Steel Plow. It is a singular misfortune of the human condition that we are so often baffled by the very ground upon which we stand. To the uninitiated, dirt is merely dirt, a brown, unremarkable substance that exists primarily to be walked upon or to be tracked into the parlor by a clumsy dog. But to the pioneers who first looked upon the vast, rolling expanse of the Illinois prairie, the dirt was not a partner. It was an antagonist. It was a dark, rich, and monumentally stubborn adhesive that seemed determined to prevent the advancement of civilization by the simple, effective means of clinging to any iron blade that dared to pierce its surface. The soil of the Midwest is a miracle of fertility, a black gold banquet for any seed that wishes to sprout and reach for the heavens. But in the early days, it was a trap. A farmer would hitch his oxen to a wooden plow, drop the blade into the earth, and move forward precisely 3 inches before the soil, displaying the structural integrity of industrial-grade glue, would seize the implement in an unbreakable embrace. The farmer would be forced to stop, unhitch his team, and spend the better part of the afternoon scraping the earth off the plow with a heavy iron shovel, all the while uttering language that would have made a riverboat captain blush with envy. It was a tedious, back-breaking, and fundamentally fruitless labor. It was, in point of fact, a struggle that threatened to render the heartland a place of eternal, unplowed wilderness. And then, into this stalemate of mud and misery, stepped Mr. John Deere. Now, there are many men who have been hailed as titans of industry, men who built empires on the backs of railroads or the flow of oil, but few have earned their place in the pantheon of history by the simple virtue of understanding the nature of a sticky blade. John Deere was a blacksmith by trade, a man who possessed the rare and beautiful gift of looking at a problem and seeing a mechanical solution that did not require a committee of experts or a budget that could have funded a small war. He possessed the wisdom to realize that the fault lay not in the farmer nor in the soil, but in the friction of the metal itself. The story, or at least the story as it has been polished by time into a piece of regional mythology, is that Deere happened upon a broken saw blade. It was a thing of tempered, polished steel, shiny and smooth. He looked at that blade, and he had a vision. He saw that if a plowshare were constructed not of rough cast iron that invited the dirt to cling, but of highly polished steel that encouraged the dirt to slide, the prairie could be conquered. It was a triumph of metallurgical common sense. It was the moment the Midwest stopped being a swampy obstacle to human progress and started being the breadbasket of the world. He fashioned his plow, hitched it to a team, and went to work. The earth, which had spent centuries successfully defending itself against the advances of the cast-iron intruders, found itself suddenly and hilariously outmatched. The soil curled away from the polished steel in a smooth, effortless ribbon. It was as if the earth itself had decided to surrender and accept its new role as the servant of mankind. The news spread with the speed of a prairie fire. From every corner of the valley, farmers came to witness this minor miracle of the blacksmith shop, And they left not merely with a plow, but with a new philosophy of life, that no problem is so stubborn that it cannot be solved by a bit of polish and a better grasp of the physics of friction. It is a grand, whimsical comedy when you stop to consider it. The idea that the future of an entire nation was secured because one man decided that dirt was just a matter of surface tension. We have built cathedrals of commerce, sprawling dealerships that shine like beacons in the rural night, and museums of such gilded grandeur that you would think we were worshiping the gods of agriculture themselves. And all of it, every last gear and sprocket, every last corporate spreadsheet, every last leap of the jumping deer logo, descends from that one moment of realization over a broken saw blade. There is a lesson here, I think, for those who are willing to hear it. We live in an age that is obsessed with the monumental. We are convinced that if we want to change the world, we must move mountains, invent something that connects the entire globe to a single network, or create a technology that renders the laws of physics obsolete. We are seduced by the grandiosity of the machine, by the scale of the operation, by the complexity of the design. And yet, the history of the Quad Cities reminds us that real, genuine progress, the kind that actually feeds people, the kind that actually transforms a landscape, is often the result of something much simpler. It is the result of looking at a very small problem, scratching one's head, and realizing that if you just smooth out the edges, the world will get out of your way. The John Deere empire grew as all such things do, until it became an entity so vast it seemed to possess a personality of its own. It became a culture, a code, a way of life. In these parts, you do not simply buy a tractor. You make a commitment. You signal your allegiance to the green and the yellow with the same fervor that a medieval knight might display toward the colors of his house. I have sat in local diners and heard farmers debate the merits of a specific transmission or a specific chassis with the intensity that the philosophers of old brought to their debates on the nature of the soul. They know the anatomy of their machines better than they know the anatomy of their own kin. And why shouldn't they? Their livelihoods depend on these steel beasts, and their loyalty to the brand is as firm as the soil their ancestors labored to tame. And the museum. Oh, to visit the John Deere Museum in Moline is to witness a spectacle of reverence that is truly a sight to behold. There are the polished, gleaming relics of the past, displayed under lights so bright they would shame the sun, and there are the modern giants, standing in rows like mechanical behemoths, waiting for the call to the harvest. One walks through the halls and feels a distinct, creeping sense of piety. You are not meant to touch the exhibits. You are meant to marvel at the evolution. You are meant to walk away with the understanding that this was not merely business. It was a crusade. It was the taming of the wild, the subjugation of the chaos, and the imposition of order upon a land that had never known it. And yet, for all the chrome in the history books, for all the global reach and the high-tech mapping and the satellite-guided navigation that now governs the planting of the seed, the core of the thing remains unchanged. It is still about the steel. It is still about the interaction between the metal and the earth. It is still about that initial beautiful moment when a man realized that if you make the surface smooth enough, the earth will yield. It is a story of grit, and it is a story of oil, and it is a story of the thousands of men and women who have spent their lives in the shadow of the green and yellow, keeping the wheels turning and the rows straight. It is a story that, in its own way, is as profoundly American as the Mississippi itself. We are a people who love a machine that works. We love a thing that we can understand, a thing that we can fix with a wrench, and a thing that pays us back for our labor with a bountiful harvest. So, let the world continue its love affair with the ephemeral. Let it chase its clouds and its codes and its digital mirages. Here, in the valley of the steel plow, we shall keep our feet firmly on the ground. We shall look at the horizon and see not a screen, but a field. We shall look at a tractor and see not a product, but a partner. And if, on some quiet golden afternoon, you happen to see a man standing in the middle of a vast brown acre, watching his blade slice through the earth with that effortless shimmering grace, tip your hat to him. He is not merely farming. He is participating in a ritual that is as old as the discovery of the saw blade, and he is doing it with the same stubborn, triumphant, and utterly American confidence that drove John Deere to change the world one furrow at a time. It is a grand, honest, and delightfully dirty history, and I, for one, would not trade it for all the software in the world. Chapter 7. The Effie Afton versus the Future. In the year of our Lord 1856, the Mississippi River was not merely a body of water, it was the great churning artery of commerce for a nation that had not yet learned that speed was a virtue. To be a steamboat captain in those days was to occupy a position of supreme importance, comparable to that of an emperor, or perhaps a particularly successful circus ringmaster. You commanded a towering white-painted monstrosity that possessed the grace of a floating wedding cake and the industrial might of a very angry tea kettle. You ruled the river, you defied the snags, and you looked upon the shore-dwelling folk with the benevolent, weary pity of a man who traveled while they merely stood still. But progress, that relentless iron-willed intruder, had a habit of arriving in the most inconvenient places. It arrived in the form of a railroad bridge, the first of its kind, stretching its spindly, defiant fingers across the river from Rock Island to the Iowa shore. To the railroad men, this bridge was a triumph of the modern age, a pathway for the screeching, soot-belching iron horses that were soon to make the steamboat as obsolete as the stagecoach. To the steamboat captains, however, the bridge was not a triumph. It was a personal insult, an obstacle, and a wicked, un-American obstruction of the God-given right to navigate the river without having to dodge a collection of stationary pillars. The tension between these two factions reached its boiling point with the Effie Afton. She was a fine, sturdy boat, a lady of the river who had navigated the currents with the skill of a seasoned pilot. But on one fateful spring day, the Effie Afton found herself in a dance with the new bridge, and it was a dance that neither party was particularly keen to lead. Whether it was the fault of the river's currents, the incompetence of the pilot, or the simple, malicious intent of the bridge to exist in the path of the boat, remains a subject of heated debate among those who still hold grudges over matters from the previous century. The Effie Afton struck the bridge, suffered a catastrophe of timber and steam, and ended up a ruined, waterlogged mess that served as a rallying cry for every man who believed that the river belonged to the boat, and the boat alone. The litigation that followed was a legal spectacle of the highest order. The steamboat companies, sensing that their empire was slipping away, sued to have the bridge declared a nuisance, a maritime hazard that ought to be dismantled and tossed into the mud. They brought in the best lawyers, the most grizzled river pilots, and a collection of experts who could testify with a straight face that the bridge was a death trap, designed by men who clearly had no respect for the sacred laws of navigation. It was a battle for the soul of the American West. If the bridge stood, the railroad would win, and the river would be reduced to a quaint, scenic curiosity, rather than the highway of the world. And into this fray stepped a young, gangly, and rather unassuming lawyer from Springfield named Abraham Lincoln. He was not yet the great emancipator nor the solemn, bearded savior of the Republic. He was simply a man who knew his way around a courtroom and understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the locomotive was the engine of a future that would not be denied. Lincoln stood before the court and argued not merely for the bridge, but for the idea that a man's right to travel across the country on a train was as fundamental as a captain's right to navigate the water. He understood that you could not halt the march of the iron horse simply because it made the river folk feel a bit cramped. The arguments were voluminous, the testimonies were dramatic, and the air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of legal posturing and the indignation of men whose way of life was vanishing before their eyes. Lincoln, with his customary slightly weary and profoundly effective wit, dismantled the case of the steamboat companies. He pointed out, with the gentle, devastating clarity of a man who has done his homework, that the bridge had been there for a good long while, and that any pilot who managed to crash into a structure that had not moved since its construction was likely a pilot who would have found a way to hit a mountain had he been given the room. It was a victory for the railroad, for the bridge, and for the inevitable grinding and often rude advancement of progress. The Effie Afton was forgotten, or at least relegated to the footnotes of history, and the bridge remained, a sentinel of steel that marked the end of the steamboat's golden age. It is a moment of historical irony that is almost too delicious to contemplate. The very bridge that the river folk tried so desperately to remove became the foundation of the modern quad cities. Without that bridge, without that clash of iron and timber, without the intervention of that Springfield lawyer, the cities we know today would likely have remained quiet, disconnected outposts, rather than the industrial pizza-loving, bridge-congested hub that we occupy now. One wonders what the old river captains would think, were they to return today and view our current state of affairs. They would see the Casca 74 bridge, a modern, soaring marvel of engineering that spans the same waters their boats once ruled, and they would see the cars moving across it in a steady, unceasing, and thoroughly maddening stream of traffic. They would see that we are still fighting over the bridges, still complaining about the traffic, and still at heart a people who are deeply suspicious of anything that changes the way we get from one side of the river to the other. We have not changed in truth. We have only traded the steamboat's paddle wheel for the automobile's internal combustion engine and the pilot's horn for the commuter's honk of frustration. It is a grand, sweeping, and fundamentally humorous progression. We are the inheritors of that great bridge debate, the spiritual descendants of the men who stood in courtrooms and argued over the right to navigate the path of the future. And every time we sit on the bridge, idling in the heat, watching the river roll beneath us with a calm, indifferent patience, we are participating in the same ancient argument. Are we a people of the river, or are we a people of the road? The answer, of course, is that we are a people of both. caught in the eternal bridge-crossed purgatory of our own making, trying to get to the other side without hitting anything along the way. The Effie Afton is gone, the captains are long since buried, and the railroad is itself being eclipsed by the flight of the airplane, but the spirit of the conflict remains. It is the spirit of a place that understands that progress is a demanding, disruptive guest who tracks mud across the floor and makes a terrible racket, but who ultimately holds the keys to the world. We have learned to live with the bridge. We have learned to tolerate the congestion. And we have learned to find a certain perverse comfort in the idea that regardless of how fast we move, the river will always be there, flowing at its own leisurely pace, watching us scurry across its back with the detached, fluid wisdom of a creature that has seen it all before. And honestly, is there any better way to live? We have our bridges, we have our trains, and we have our pizza. If we have to spend 19 minutes of our lives stuck in a traffic jam on the I-74, well, that is a small price to pay for the privilege of living in the center of the world, or at the very least, in the center of a very busy bridge. Chapter 8. The Bix Beiderbecke Blues. It is a curious and melancholy truth that the world often reserves its highest honors for those who have had the good sense to shuffle off this mortal coil before the world could truly understand them. Davenport, a city of river bluffs and respectable brickwork, is home to the memory of one such soul, Bix Beiderbecke. Bix was a man who played the cornet with a tone so pure, so golden, and so devastatingly sad that it seemed he had not learned the notes from a book, but had plucked them directly from the ether, where all the world's forgotten sorrows are kept. He was a jazz man of the highest order, a creature of the night, and a man who looked at a brass instrument and saw not a tool for producing music, but a vessel for pouring out a spirit that found the daylight hours, and indeed the sober reality of the 19th century clinging Midwest, to be a bit too bracing for his delicate constitution. The story of Bix is the story of the river itself. It had a powerful, driving energy, a muddy, turbulent undercurrent of tragedy, and a tendency to sweep everything along in its path, whether it wanted to go or not. He was born into the respectable, church-going, upstanding milieu of a Davenport household that likely hoped their son would grow up to manage a lumber yard or sell insurance. Instead, he heard the blues blowing up the river on the steam whistles and the wandering bands, and he took to the cornet with the obsession of a man trying to talk to ghosts. He played with a sound that was somehow bright and weary at the same time, like a laugh at a funeral or a sunrise viewed through a window that hadn't been cleaned since the turn of the century. Now, in the spirit of the Quad City's peculiar talent for honoring the past by doing things that would have utterly bewildered the deceased, we have the Bix 7. It is a race. It is a running race. Imagine, if you will, the great jazzman himself, a man who spent his most productive hours in the hazy, smoke-filled interiors of Chicago clubs, nursing a drink and coaxing melodies out of the dark, confronted with the spectacle of thousands of his fellow citizens, dressed in neon-colored fabrics and specialized running shoes, pounding the pavement of Davenport in the blistering, soul-sapping humidity of a July morning. One suspects that Bix, were he to observe this ritual from the great beyond, would likely offer a wry, lopsided grin, light a cigarette, and ask if perhaps they couldn't have just invited him to a comfortable tavern instead. There is, however, a strange, undeniable beauty in the Big Seven, provided one views it through the lens of local absurdity. We are a people who, having little else to do on a Saturday morning in midsummer, decide that the best way to pay tribute to a man who lived a life of beautiful, drifting improvisation is to engage in a form of exercise that is the very definition of rigid, planned, and exhausting consistency. We run the miles, we pant for air, we cross the finish line with our tongues hanging out, and we congratulate ourselves on having honored the legend. It is a perfectly quad-Citian approach to heritage. Take something deeply, profoundly soulful, and turn it into a physical ordeal that results in a commemorative T-shirt. I have spent many hours watching the runners as they swarm the streets of Davenport. They come in all shapes and sizes. The serious fellows with the watches that measure their pulse and their gait. The casual enthusiasts who look as though they are regretting every decision they have made since birth, and the folks who are clearly just there for the community spirit and the post-race hydration. They are a mosaic of human ambition, all united by the common goal of finishing a race that Bix himself, had he been offered a spot at the starting line, would have certainly traded for a quiet seat in the shade and a cool glass of something that wasn't water. But do not mistake this for mockery. It is a celebration. If Bix Beiderbecke was a man who lived life in a state of constant musical motion, then perhaps there is a peculiar rhythmic fitness to this annual stampede through the streets of his youth. Jazz, after all, is not about the destination. It is about the journey, the improvisation, the ability to take a mistake and turn it into a riff, and the willingness to keep playing even when the night gets long and the air gets thin. In that sense, every runner who struggles up those steep Davenport hills is, in his or her own clumsy way, playing a note. They are participating in the grand collective improvisation of our little slice of the world. They are the syncopation in the life of a city that otherwise prides itself on its heavy industrial brick-and-mortar reliability. And then there is the music itself. Throughout the weekend, Davenport is filled with the sound of brass, the wail of the clarinet, and the frantic, joyful tapping of the snare. It is a time when the city seems to shed its industrial skin and remember that it was once a place where the riverboats docked and the world came to dance. There are those who complain about the noise, the traffic, and the sheer overwhelming inconvenience of having their morning commute disrupted by a pack of sweating marathoners and a Dixieland band. But I ask you, what is a city if it does not occasionally inconvenience itself for the sake of its own soul? What is the point of being a quad city if we cannot, for at least one weekend a year, pretend that we are not a collection of factory floor functionaries and pizza enthusiasts, but a place where the air is filled with the spirits of the musicians who once turned the dark, river-cooled nights into something that could make a man believe in heaven? Bix didn't live long enough to see the world he helped shape. He was a flame that burned too bright, fueled by his own restless, searching genius and the unforgiving nature of his own demons. He left behind a handful of recordings, scratches on wax that still, even after all these decades, possess the power to make the heart stop and the eyes dampen. When you listen to him, you aren't listening to the past. You're listening to a man who was always in his own mind, reaching for a note that was just a little bit higher, a little bit further than he could ever quite reach. Perhaps that is why we run. We run because we too are always reaching for something that is just beyond our grasp. A little more speed, a little more endurance, a little more sense of why we're all here, running in the heat, in a place that counts to 4 while staring at 5, and that eats its pizza in strips because it refuses to conform to the standard geometry of the plate. We are all improvisers in our own way. We are all playing our own tunes, and though our notes may not be as golden as Bix's, we are playing them in the same river valley air, under the same wide Midwestern sky, and with the same stubborn, defiant hope that says, I am here, I am moving, and I am making a sound. When the last runner has crossed the line and the last jazz band has folded their chairs and the quiet descends once more upon the riverfront, one is left with a strange, lingering sense of peace. The city goes back to its business. It goes back to forging its aluminum and machining its steel and cutting its malt crust pies and complaining about the traffic on the bridge. But for those few days, Davenport was a place of music. It was a place where we stopped counting our cities and started counting our beats. And I like to think that somewhere, in the great jazz-filled silence of the beyond, Beiderbecke is listening to the distant, rhythmic thumping of thousands of feet on the pavement, and he is tapping his foot, and he is thinking that, all things considered, this is a hell of a lot better than selling insurance in the lumber yard. It is a whimsical, beautiful, and fundamentally ridiculous tribute, and I believe it is exactly the sort of thing he would have found to be entirely, perfectly, and wonderfully human. Chapter 9. The Blackhawk Hotel's Ghostly Guest List. There exists in the city of Davenport a grand towering pile of brick and aspiration known as the Hotel Blackhawk. To look upon it is to witness an architectural sermon on the theme of we shall be magnificent even if we have to bankrupt ourselves to achieve it. It has been the primary destination for every wandering dignitary, every touring performer of repute, and every minor celebrity who found themselves adrift in the upper Midwest and in desperate need of a room that didn't smell like a diesel engine. It is a place of mahogany, of velvet curtains that are heavy enough to serve as armor, and of chandeliers that hang from the ceiling like glittering frozen waterfalls, daring the patrons to be anything less than dignified. The Blackhawk is a building that has led a life of profound instability, a sort of institutional manic-depressive history. It has been built, it has been burned, it has been bankrupted, it has been renovated, and it has been rebranded with the sort of frequency that suggests the owners are either possessed of a staggering optimism or are simply trying to outrun a curse. It is the hotel that Herbert Hoover checked into when he wanted to pretend for a few hours that he wasn't the man currently tasked with being the captain of a sinking ship. It is the place where Cary Grant once walked through the lobby, and the locals, in their typical fashion, tried to guess what he did for a living before deciding he looked like he might be a good hand at selling farm equipment. But the real history of the Blackhawk, the history that you won't find in the brochures or the polished, sanitized accounts provided by the management, is the history of its ghosts. Now, I am a man who has traveled extensively, and I have learned that if a hotel is old enough, grand enough, and has witnessed enough human folly, it will inevitably develop a ghostly population. It is a law of nature, much like gravity, or the tendency of a Quad Cities pizza maker to overspice in the sauce. The ghosts of the Blackhawk are not the howling, rattling chain variety that one encounters in the cheaper sort of Gothic romances. No, these are Midwestern ghosts, They are sensible, polite, and profoundly confused. They are the sort of specters who spend their evenings wandering the hallways of the upper floors, wondering why the wallpaper has changed for the fourth time in a century, and why the gentlemen in the lobby are all staring at glowing handheld rectangles instead of reading the evening newspaper, like God intended. I have heard it said by the staff, who possess that weary, all-knowing look that comes from working in a building that refuses to be entirely dead, that there is one particular spirit who haunts the ballroom. He is said to be a gentleman of the 1920s, a man in a tuxedo, who is perpetually searching for a jazz band that has been out of business since the Great Depression. He is not a malicious fellow. He simply wants to know why the music has stopped and why the ladies are no longer wearing hats of a sensible feathered variety. One cannot help but empathize with the poor souls. Imagine being tied to a building for eternity, trapped in the architectural amber of a downtown Davenport city block. You have seen the world change from the age of the steam whistle to the age of the internal combustion engine, and then to the age of the digital ether. You have seen the rise and fall of the Prohibition-era speakeasies, the birth of the local taco pizza monstrosities, and the unending rhythmic parade of the Big Seven runners, and you are still forced to hang about in the mezzanine, waiting for a checkout time that will never arrive. It is an existential predicament that would drive a living man to drink, and I suspect it is the only reason our local ghosts are so quiet. They are simply too baffled by the modern world to bother with the indignity of haunting. The Blackhawk is also the repository of 1,000 whispered conversations, the sort of talk that happens when men of influence get together behind closed doors and decide the fate of the local economy. It is a place of mahogany-paneled conspiracy. I have often imagined the conversations that have taken place in those suites, the talk of rail extensions, the bartering of factory site locations, the secret agreements about which city gets the bridge repairs and which one gets the water main leaks. If these walls could talk, they would likely be sued for libel, or perhaps just for being remarkably, crushingly boring. The ghosts, at least, have the good sense to keep their grievances to themselves, which is more than I can say for the average Quad Cities city council member. There is a certain unmistakable tragedy in the way we treat such buildings. We are a culture that is perpetually obsessed with the new. We want the lobby to be modern. We want the Wi-Fi to be blindingly fast. And we want the service to be a seamless, dehumanized experience that requires as little contact with another human as possible. And yet, there is the Blackhawk, standing on the corner like an aging dowager in a dress that is slightly out of fashion, watching us with a kind, judgmental eye. It has survived the fire, it has survived the bankruptcy, and it has survived the rebranding, and yet it remains the only place in town where a man can order a martini and feel for a brief moment that he is living in a world that has a sense of style. One of my favorite pastimes while staying in the Blackhawk is to sit in the lobby and watch the guests as they arrive. There is always a moment of hesitation, a split second, when they cross the threshold and realize that the hotel is not merely a place to sleep, but a place that has opinions about their conduct. There is the businessman who is trying to look important, the tourist who is looking for a power outlet, and the local who has wandered in because he heard the coffee was good and he wanted to sit in a leather chair that wasn't covered in a questionable modern fabric. They all, in their own way, contribute to the tapestry of the hotel. They all, for a night or a weekend, become a part of the long, strange, and fundamentally confused history of the place. I have come to believe that the ghosts of the Blackhawk are not trapped there at all. I believe they stay because they are waiting to see what happens next. They are the ultimate observers of the Quad Cities comedy. They have seen the city grow, they have seen it sprawl, and they have seen it try to convince the rest of the world that quad means 5. They are, in essence, the only residents of Davenport who are truly capable of appreciating the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of the entire project. Why would they leave? Where else could they find a better seat to watch the parade of human ambition, greed, and taco pizza-related poor judgment? If you ever find yourself in the Blackhawk and you happen to see a gentleman in a tuxedo standing by the elevator looking as though he has just lost a $5 bet on a horse race, do not be alarmed. He is not a threat. He is merely an early 20th century ghost who is waiting for the jazz band to strike up. Or perhaps he is just waiting for the current generation of politicians to finish their negotiations so he can regain the use of the ballroom. Either way, treat him with the respect due to any man who has endured the hotel's history and has not yet had the sense to check out. We are all, in our own way, ghosts of the Blackhawk, haunted by the memories of the city we thought we were, and perpetually bewildered by the city we have actually become. And really, in a place that counts to 4 while staring at 5, is there any better way to pass the time? Chapter 10. The Tri-City Delusion. It is a well-established law of the universe that the further one retreats from the centers of intellectual gravity, by which I mean those places where men spend their days arguing over the proper way to arrange commas in a legal brief, the more one finds a local population that is entirely untethered from the rigid, pedantic requirements of arithmetics. In the great, wide, and remarkably unconcerned expanse of the American heartland, numbers are not considered cold, hard facts to be worshipped. They are considered suggestions, or at the very least, flexible starting points for a conversation that may or may not arrive at a conclusion. Nowhere is this more joyously, infuriatingly evident than in the case of the Tri-City Delusion. For several decades, the newspapers of the Mississippi Valley, those august, ink-stained chroniclers of our daily triumphs and our spectacular misadventures, insisted with the unwavering, polite, and thoroughly irrational stubbornness of a mule in a mud bog that we were living in a Tri-City. They printed it on their mastheads. They shouted it from their editorial rooftops, and they required every schoolboy to recite it as a catechism of civic geography. The Tri-Cities, a tidy, sensible, and profoundly attractive designation that suggested a unity of purpose, a harmony of governance, and a grasp of the basic fundamentals of counting. There was but one minor and utterly insignificant hitch in this entire grandiose architecture. There were, by any honest count of the municipal structures that littered the riverbank, no fewer than 3 cities involved, followed by 2 more that had evidently been invited to the party, but were currently standing in the hallway, waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence. To walk up to a citizen of the era and inquire, with the innocent curiosity of a traveler, as to exactly which 3 of the 5 cities constituted this Tri, was to witness a transformation of the human countenance that would have fascinated the most dedicated student of the theater. The citizen would frown. He would scratch his chin. He would look off into the distance at the river, and he would begin a recitation of municipal names that never, by any stretch of the imagination, arrived at the number 3. He would mutter about Davenport and Moline and perhaps Rock Island, or wait, was it Bettendorf? And what, in the name of all that was holy, was to be done about East Moline, which was right there, minding its own business, and contributing its fair share of tax revenue and industrial noise, yet stubbornly excluded from the sacred trinity? It was a delusion of the highest order, a civic hallucination sustained by sheer Midwestern force of will. It was the sort of magnificent, harmless, and entirely nonsensical pride that makes one want to weep with admiration. We are a people who, when faced with the cold, unyielding reality of the Fifth City, do not simply adjust our name. We pretend that the Fifth City is a figment of a fevered imagination. We engage in a sort of municipal gaslighting that would be the envy of any self-respecting secret society. We are the Tri-Cities, and if you can count past 3, then you are clearly overthinking the matter and are kindly requested to take your calculator elsewhere. The humor, of course, lies in the fact that everyone knew. Everyone knew. The editors of the papers knew. The mayors knew. The men who drove the tractors and the men who milled the steel and the men who stood in line for their malt crust pizza, they all knew that the arithmetic was as broken as a riverboat engine on a Sunday morning. But to admit it would have been an act of civic treason. It would have meant acknowledging that our identity was not a solid, logical fact, but a fragile, shifting, and profoundly confused collection of riverbank settlements held together by a bridge, a shared love for the blues, and a mutual agreement to ignore the reality of our own borders. There is a sort of genius in this, really. It is the genius of a people who have realized that if you tell a lie loudly enough and long enough and with enough conviction, it eventually takes on the weight of a stone monument. We weren't just a region. We were an idea. We were the idea that we were a cohesive 3-part unit, a sort of industrial musketeer trio that was strong, unified, and entirely indifferent to the fact that we had sprouted a pair of extra municipalities when nobody was looking. It is the triumph of the spirit over the census. It is the victory of the narrative over the spreadsheet. And if there is one thing that the human heart craves more than anything else, it is the ability to ignore the inconvenient reality of the Fifth City in favor of the pleasing, elegant symmetry of the Third. One can only imagine the conversations that occurred in the boardrooms of the local chambers of commerce. Gentlemen, one might hear, the Census Bureau is currently insisting that our population suggests we have expanded and that East Moline has, in fact, become a permanent, tax-paying, and remarkably persistent fixture of our collective existence. They seem to be implying that we are now, by any standard definition, a quad, or heaven forbid, a quint region. And the response would be a collective, weary groan. Preposterous! We have always been a tri-city. It is written on the masthead. It is printed on the letterhead. We shall simply ignore the Fifth City until it grows tired of being ignored and decides to move somewhere else. And they did ignore it. They ignored it with a dedication that borders on the sublime. They ignored it until the pressure became too great, until the sheer, undeniable reality of the sprawl forced them to concede that perhaps, just perhaps, they were not a trio, but a quartet. And even then, when they finally made the switch, they did it with a palpable, begrudging sense of loss. They were a quad. It sounded so much less nimble, so much less elegant, so much less like a perfectly balanced, three-legged stool of industrial progress. It sounded like an admission of defeat. It sounded like they had finally been forced to acknowledge that they were simply too large, too sprawled, and too fundamentally disorganized to maintain the fiction of the three. But the habit of the delusion died hard. To this day, you will find old-timers who still whisper the name of the Tri-Cities as if they were referencing a lost utopian golden age, a time when the cities were few, the pizza was simple, and the math was something a man could manage on his fingers without needing to take off his boots. It is a charming, wistful, and entirely hilariously wrong-headed nostalgia for a time that never actually existed, because East Moline has always been there, just as stubborn and just as industrial and just as much a part of the riverbank as its older, louder, and more self-important siblings. It is a beautiful thing, the Tri-City Delusion. It is the story of a region that tried to force itself into a shape that was smaller, tidier, and more manageable than its own sprawling industrial soul allowed. We are, and have always been, a chaotic, multiplying, and fundamentally uncountable mess. We are 5 cities, we are a region, we are a river-swept industrial engine that refuses to sit still long enough to be accurately enumerated. And if we had to spend a few decades living in a dream of 3, well, who are we to judge? We are only human, after all, and if there is one thing humans are truly excellent at, it is the art of looking at a crowd of 5 and insisting with a perfectly straight face that they are looking at a trio. It is the most honest, delightful, and quintessentially quad-citian thing we have ever done. We are at last a quad, but we have the heart of a tri, and that, I suspect, is exactly the sort of confused, contradictory, and entirely marvelous identity that we deserve. Chapter 11. The Inventions Nobody Asked For. There is a peculiar, restless spirit that haunts the Quad Cities, a phantom itch of the creative faculty that compels the locals to tinker with the fundamental order of the universe. It is not enough for us to exist as a collection of industrial municipalities perched upon the banks of a river that cannot decide which way to flow. No, we must also be the progenitors of things that the rest of the world never knew it lacked, but which, once presented, it cannot seem to cast aside. We are a region of accidental innovators, a laboratory of the mundane, and the primary source of those peculiar Midwestern improvements that make one wonder if perhaps the local water supply contains an excess of restless, inventively inclined minerals. Consider, if you will, the sliced loaf of bread. A simple enough concept, you might think. A baker takes a sharp blade, he takes a loaf of yeast-risen perfection, and he performs a series of uniform cuts. It seems a task so elemental that one would imagine it had been performed since the dawn of agriculture. And yet it was an Iowan, a man of the Quad Cities vicinity, who looked at a loaf of bread and decided that the act of slicing it by hand was a monumental, civilization-stunting inefficiency. He built a machine. He engineered a solution to a problem that, quite frankly, no one had complained about in the previous 6,000 years of human history. And the world, caught up in the modern fervor for efficiency, seized upon it with a delight that was entirely disproportionate to the actual convenience of the thing. We had invented the sliced bread, and the world, in its simple-mindedness, decided that this was the very pinnacle of human achievement, against which all other accomplishments would henceforth be measured. It is a whimsical thing, is it not? To be the standard by which the world measures its progress, and to have arrived at that standard by way of a mechanical bread cutter in a town that most people couldn't find on a map without the assistance of a very detailed atlas. But we did not stop with bread. Oh, no. We are an ambitious people, and our ambition is seldom satisfied by the merely practical. We have a tendency to look at the culinary landscape and ask ourselves, what is the most inconvenient, the most baffling, and the most structurally unsound way to prepare this meal? This is how we arrived at the taco pizza, a monstrosity that I have previously lamented, but which must be revisited here as the crowning achievement of our regional madness. To take a pizza, an Italian institution of reasonable circular logic, and to decide that it requires the addition of salsa, lettuce, and crushed corn chips is a leap of imagination that borders on the divine. It is an invention that defies the very laws of structural engineering. It is an invention that demands, as a prerequisite for consumption, a total abandonment of one's dignity. And yet, we hold it up as a point of civic pride. We take our out-of-town visitors to the local establishments, and we watch with a sort of sadistic glee as they attempt to reconcile the concept of a hot lettuce with the concept of a pizza. These are the things that define us. We are the architects of the unnecessary and the engineers of the absurd. We have a habit of fixing things that were never broken, and in doing so, we have inadvertently created a culture of mild, ongoing industrial eccentricity. Walk into any local workshop or garage, and you are likely to find a man who is currently in the process of inventing a better way to hold a hammer, or a more efficient method of storing a screwdriver, or a completely proprietary 4-stage process for the cleaning of a spark plug. It is an itch. It is a permanent, persistent, and entirely incurable condition of the local psyche. We look at the world, and we do not see it as a finished product. We see it as a work in progress that requires our personal mechanical intervention. This obsession with the new and improved extends even into our city planning, if one can truly call the Quad Cities planned in any sense of the word. We have a bridge, the E74, that has become a sort of secular monument to our regional struggle with the concept of getting from here to there. We have invested vast sums of capital. We have commissioned the most brilliant minds of the architectural profession, and we have spent years of our collective existence sitting in traffic to witness the creation of a span that is meant to be the final, ultimate, and definitive solution to our transit woes. And yet, it is as if the bridge itself is merely another of our inventions, a work that will surely require a sequel or a series of adjustments, or a complete, reimagined second act in the decades to come. We do not build things to be finished. We build things to be adjusted, pondered, and improved upon until they are entirely unrecognizable. There is a profound, if somewhat dusty, wisdom in this. We are a people who have learned that the world is a malleable place. We have learned that the way things are is not necessarily the way they have to be. If the bread can be sliced, why not slice it? If the pizza can be topped with a salad, why not top it? If the river can be spanned with a bridge that costs a king's ransom and takes a generation to build, then by all means, let us span it, and let us argue about the result for the next 100 years. It is an outlook that is entirely, vibrantly, and aggressively American. It is the spirit of the tinkerer, the spirit of the inventor, and the spirit of the man who looks at a perfectly good morning and decides that it would be better if he spent it in the shop, taking apart the lawnmower, just to see how it works. I suspect that if you were to look deep into the archives of the Regional Patent Office, if such a place were to exist, and were to be staffed by a man who had the patience to catalog our local follies, you would find a record of inventions that would make a man's hair stand on end. You would find blueprints for automatic bait casters, designs for improved corn shuckers that failed because they were too efficient for their own good, and perhaps even a patent for a pair of eyeglasses designed specifically for the viewing of the Mississippi River in a fog. We are a factory of the whimsical. We are a hub of the hypothetical. We are a community that lives for the what if and the wouldn't it be better if, regardless of whether the answer is actually yes. But perhaps that is why we are here, perhaps the reason we have endured, why we have flourished, and why we have managed to turn a river bend into a bustling industrial powerhouse, is precisely because we are a people who are never truly satisfied. We are a people who look at the status quo and see an opportunity for an upgrade. We are the inventors of the unnecessary, the architects of the peculiar, and the proud malt-crusted engineers of our own destiny. We may not have invented the telephone or the light bulb or the internet, but we have invented the taco pizza and the machine-cut loaf. And I dare say that for the average citizen of this river valley, those contributions to the human experience are far more significant, far more delicious, and far more likely to leave a lasting mark on the morning routine of the Republic. So, traveler, when you find yourself passing through this strange industrial corridor, take a moment to look at the machines, at the pizza, and at the bridges. Do not look at them as finished, static objects. Look at them as the manifestations of a local imagination that has never once been told that enough is enough. Look at them and understand that you are in a place where the people believe that the best is always just one more adjustment away. It is a whimsical, stubborn, and profoundly ambitious way to live. And if you are ever asked for your opinion, you might tell them that they are quite mad. But you should tell them with a smile, for there is a certain unmistakable charm in a people who are so dedicated to the constant, unnecessary, and entirely glorious improvement of the world. Chapter 12. The Commuter's Purgatory. If there be a state of existence between the mortal coil and the grand, final tallying of one's deeds, I suspect it bears a striking resemblance to the experience of crossing the Mississippi River on the Nahaster 74 bridge during the hours of the morning or evening commute. It is a place that defies the conventional measurement of time. In the civilized world, time is measured in seconds, minutes, and hours, the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock that guides the affairs of men. But in the purgatory of the bridge, time is measured in the slow, agonizing crawl of the bumper in front of you and the philosophical realization that your life is being whittled away, one 10-foot increment at a time, while you contemplate the back of a delivery truck. It is here that the modern Quad Cityan finds his true calling as a practitioner of Stoic philosophy. One does not simply drive across the bridge. One endures the bridge. One settles into the driver's seat with the resignation of a weary pilgrim embarking upon a journey to a holy site that he is entirely certain he will never actually reach. You pull onto the ramp. You merge with the flow of the collective, frustrated consciousness of the region, and you resign yourself to the 19-minute odyssey, a duration which, as any seasoned traveler of these parts will tell you, is a figure of speech that has absolutely no basis in reality. It is a promise made by the gods of traffic to keep the populace from descending into a state of total, unadulterated madness. There is a specific, melancholy beauty to the view from the bridge. You are suspended high above the great brown current of the Mississippi, a river that has seen the rise of nations and the fall of steamships, and you are afforded the grand panoramic perspective of a bird, if that bird were entirely immobile and profoundly irritated by the lack of upward mobility. You look out over the river, you see the distant smokestacks of Arconic, you see the silent, watchful gaze of the Arsenal Island, and you see the sprawling concrete puzzle of the cities below. It is a view that ought to inspire awe, or perhaps a moment of quiet, contemplative grace. Instead, it inspires the overwhelming desire to see if there is any truth to the rumor that the driver in the adjacent lane has left his turn signal on since the last presidential election. The traffic jam is a great equalizer. In the purgatory of the bridge, the distinction between the man in the brand-new luxury sedan and the man in the rusted, sputtering pickup truck vanishes entirely. They are both members of the same frustrated fraternity. They are both victims of the same collective failure to arrive at their destinations in a timely fashion. They stare at the same expanse of concrete. They listen to the same droning, repetitive radio advertisements for local car dealerships and furniture warehouses, and they share the same silent prayer. Please, dear Lord, let the brake lights in front of me go dark, and let the road ahead be empty for at least a furlong. It is a place where the mind begins to wander, freed from the mundane requirements of the actual act of driving, which is mostly a matter of observing the stationary object in front of you and attempting to avoid the temptation to read a book, compose a letter, or take up a new hobby in the interim. I have seen men who have clearly been on this bridge for so long that they have begun to grow facial hair of a significant unkempt variety. I have seen women who have finished entire novels, written the first draft of their memoirs, and perhaps learned a rudimentary grasp of a foreign language, all while waiting for the lane to open. It is a classroom, a meditation chamber, a courtroom of one's own conscience. It is everything, in fact, except a road. And what of the bridge itself? It is a marvel, a triumph of the engineering profession, a soaring, interconnected web of steel and light that is meant to represent the forward-thinking ambition of the Quad Cities. And yet, there is something deeply, inherently funny about the way we treat it. We spend decades discussing it, years building it, and an eternity debating whether it was worth the trouble. It is our regional monument to the what if. What if we hadn't built it? What if we had just stayed on our respective sides of the river, trading via carrier pigeon and shouting across the water? We view the bridge with a mix of gratitude and profound, lingering resentment. We are glad that it exists, and we are quite certain that it was designed by a man who possessed a personal vendetta against the concept of a prompt arrival. There is a sort of purgatorial poetry to the traffic. We are all of us, in our own small motorized ways, caught in the flow of the river, only to find ourselves stuck in the eddy of the commute. We want to be elsewhere. We want to be at our desks, or at our homes, or in our workshops in Geneseo, or perhaps at a Happy Joe's waiting for a pizza, that is currently being shredded into strips for our convenience. But we are here, in the Purgatory, suspended in the amber of the morning heat, becoming part of the great, interconnected, and fundamentally stationary machine of the Quad Cities transit system. Sometimes, when the gridlock is particularly absolute, when the flow has completely ceased and we are all reduced to sitting in our idling climate-controlled cells, I find myself looking over at the other drivers. I see the weariness in their eyes, the slumped posture of their shoulders, the twitching of their fingers against the steering wheel. I see the human condition in all its frustration, its persistence, and its capacity for quiet, stubborn endurance. We are, all of us, the characters in a very long, very slow-moving comedy. We are the actors in a play where the plot is permanently delayed, the dialogue is provided by the morning radio talk show hosts, and the scenery is a combination of gray concrete and the occasional fleeting glimpse of a bald eagle that is, quite frankly, smarter than the lot of us, for having the good sense to fly. There is a wisdom, I suppose, in the delay. It forces us to confront the silence. It forces us to acknowledge that, for all our talk of speed, of efficiency, and of the necessity of the 19-minute commute, we are not really in control of the pace at which we live. The bridge is the great, humbling teacher. It tells us that we can build the biggest spans, that we can use the most sophisticated software to manage the flow of the cars, and that we can promise the most efficient transit in the history of the Republic. But at the end of the day, we are at the mercy of the gridlock. We are at the mercy of the collective human moment. We are at the mercy of the bridge, which stands there quiet and indifferent, watching us wait for the future that is currently stalled in the left lane. So, traveler, when you find yourself in the Purgatory, do not despair. Do not curse the road, and do not blame the planners, and for heaven's sake, do not stare too intently at the back of the delivery truck in front of you, for it will only lead to a state of profound existential melancholy. Instead, look out at the river. Watch the water as it flows in its horizontal, crab-like shuffle toward the west. Remind yourself that the river does not have a commute. The river is not worried about being late for work. The river is not concerned with the structural integrity of the Malt Crust pizza or the local identity crisis. The river simply flows, and in the grand, timeless scale of the Mississippi, our 19-minute delays are but the blink of an eye, the fleeting, insignificant stutter of a region that is so busy building its future that it has entirely forgotten how to stay out of its own way. And really, is that not the true, grand, and whimsical purpose of the Quad Cities? To be a place that is so dedicated to moving forward that it has, quite miraculously, managed to create a purgatory where we can all sit still, look at the view, and appreciate the absurdity of it all. It is a grand, slow-motion ballet, and we are all, quite fortunately, in the cast. Chapter 13, The Wickedest City in America. If you have ever had the misfortune to sit through a sermon delivered by a man who believes that the modern world is a paved road to perdition, you have likely heard the legend of Davenport's Bucktown. It is a name that echoes through the annals of local history, like the distant, tinny sound of a player piano in a basement. A moniker that suggests a place where the rules of civilization were not merely ignored, but were formally invited to leave the premises and never return. In the gilded, soot-stained twilight of the 19th century, Bucktown was a district of such vibrant, unapologetic, and thoroughly un-Midwestern wickedness that it made the local clergy reach for their smelling salts every time they had to walk past the district's outer perimeter. It was the place where the riverboats docked, the sailors disembarked, and the moral compasses of the region went to experience a prolonged and highly enjoyable period of magnetic instability. To the respectable, bricklaying, church-going citizenry of Davenport, Bucktown was a festering sore upon the body politic, a place of speakeasies, gaming dens, and establishments that catered to the appetites of men who had been away from their families for long enough to forget the color of their wives' eyes. It was a district that hummed with the electric current of human desire, unregulated and entirely indifferent to the municipal ordinances of the day. There were saloons where a man could lose his month's wages before he had finished his second lager, and there were gambling halls where the dice were not so much rolled as they were tossed into the hands of fate, which in Bucktown almost always had a thumb on the scale. The irony, of course, is that while the clergy were busy thunderously condemning the district from their pulpits, a significant portion of the city's population was busy finding it to be the most interesting place within 100 miles. There is a grand, whimsical comedy in the way we humans talk about our wicked places. We condemn them, we label them, and we demand that they be razed to the ground, yet we visit them with the regularity of a man visiting his favorite tailor. Bucktown was the city's shadow self, a place where the rigid, industrious, and fundamentally uptight reality of the Mississippi Valley took a night off to wear a feathered hat and drink gin. It was where the industrial ambition of the region met the raw, unvarnished reality of human impulse, and the result was a chaotic, beautiful, and fundamentally honest mess. I have spent many hours imagining the daily life of that district. I see the sailors, fresh from the muddy, churning currents of the river, their eyes wide with the promise of dry land and a warm drink. I see the laborers, their hands stained with the grease of the foundries and the soot of the rail yards, looking for a way to turn their hard-earned coins into a few hours of forgetfulness. And I see the proprietors of these establishments, men and women of a shrewd and mercenary nature, who understood that in a world of factories and farms, the most valuable commodity was not the plowshare or the aluminum rivet, but the ability to provide a place where a man could feel, for a fleeting hour, that he was the master of his own fate. The wickedness of Bucktown, when viewed through the cool, detached lens of history, appears less like a conspiracy of the devil and more like the inevitable outcome of a town that was trying too hard to be respectable. When you live in a world of stern, upright, and fundamentally humorless industry, when you are expected to spend your days turning iron into plows and your nights thinking about the price of corn, you are eventually going to need a place where you can be entirely, gloriously, and dangerously human. Bucktown was not an anomaly. It was a release valve. It was the steam escaping from the boiler of Davenport's civic pride. Without such a district, I suspect the city would have eventually collapsed under the weight of its own solemnity, leaving behind nothing but a collection of empty churches and a population that had forgotten how to smile. The local bishop, a man of such profound, lingering, and perpetually offended piety that he seemed to be made of equal parts starch and indignation, was particularly fond of describing Bucktown as the very gates of hell. It was a description that the residents of the district likely found to be excellent for business. If you are running a saloon that specializes in high-quality spirits and low-quality company, having the bishop describe your establishment as a gateway to the abyss is essentially the same as a formal endorsement from the local Chamber of Commerce. It was a marketing masterstroke that cost the district nothing, and it ensured that every young man in the county knew exactly where to go if he wanted to see the forbidden sights. One must also admire the sheer unbridled creativity of the criminal element in those days. It was not the sophisticated, organized, and fundamentally boring villainy that we see in the modern age, where everything is done through computers and offshore accounts. No, it was a tactile, personal, and profoundly imaginative brand of mischief. There were the shell game artists who could make a pea vanish into thin air while holding your gaze with the intensity of a hypnotist. There were the gamblers who played with decks so heavily marked that even a blind man could have spotted a king. And there were the ladies of the evening who carried their own sense of history and an entirely pragmatic view of the human heart. It was a theater of the absurd, played out against a backdrop of sawdust and flickering gaslight. When the forces of reform finally arrived, as they always do, with their badges, their axes, and their unshakable and fundamentally annoying conviction that they are doing the work of a higher power, they came for Bucktown with the enthusiasm of a man cleaning out a garage. They closed the saloons, they shuttered the dens, and they replaced the flickering lights with the cold, unforgiving glow of civic progress. They turned the wicked district into the respectable, orderly, and entirely forgettable neighborhoods that occupy those blocks today. They scrubbed the history clean, polished the streets until they gleamed with the antiseptic shine of the modern era, and patted themselves on the back for having saved the city from its own dark impulses. And yet, if you walk those streets today, and if you listen with the ears of a man who knows that history is never entirely dead, you can still feel the faint, lingering pulse of the old district. You can see it in the architecture, in the narrowness of the alleys, and in the way the shadows seem to congregate in the corners of the buildings as if waiting for the return of the gaslight. You can sense that the city is still deep down, trying to forget what it once was, and that it is still, in a way, just a little bit embarrassed by the fact that it once possessed the capacity for such spectacular, unadulterated mischief. I find it to be a charming sort of embarrassment. It is the embarrassment of a man who has grown old and respectable, and who occasionally finds himself blushing at the memory of the things he did when he was 20 and full of poor judgment. Davenport should not be ashamed of Bucktown. It should be proud of it. It should be proud of the fact that it was once a place of such vitality that it couldn't be contained within the walls of a proper, church-going morality. It should celebrate the fact that it was once the wickedest city, because it proves that there is a soul underneath all that brick, a spirit that cannot be entirely suppressed by the ordinances of the city council or the condemnations of the local clergy. We are all of us a mix of the respectable and the wicked. We are a mix of the industrial ambition that builds the bridge and the human impulse that wants to stand on the shore and watch the world go by with a drink in our hand. We are the architects of the iron plow and the participants in the shell game. We are the city that builds the Blackhawk Hotel and the city that once played host to the gates of hell. And if you ask me, that is exactly the sort of place that is worth writing about. It is a place that understands that there is no light without shadow, no bridge without a shore, and no history without a few chapters that you'd rather not read to your grandchildren. So let us raise a toast to Bucktown, the city that lived, the city that laughed, and the city that provided the most interesting and fundamentally honest portion of our local story. It was a wicked, messy, and entirely delightful mistake, and I, for one, would not have had it any other way. It was the highlight of our local comedy, and I suspect that even the ghosts, if they had the chance, would tell you that the nightlife in those days was, all things considered, a damn sight better than the alternative. Chapter 14. The River Goes Visiting. It is a well-known fact among those who dwell upon the banks of the Mississippi that the river is not merely a body of water. It is a landlord of exceedingly temperamental disposition, and it is prone to bouts of expansion that the local population finds entirely uncalled for. Throughout most of the year, the river is a gentleman, a wide, muddy, and reasonably polite neighbor that stays within its designated channel and allows us the luxury of believing that we are the masters of the shoreline. But every so often, the river decides it has seen quite enough of its own bed, and that it would prefer to spend the spring months conducting a tour of the local downtown storefronts, the basement apartments of Davenport, and the lower-lying infrastructure of the riverfront parks. This is known, in the local parlance, as the spring flood, though it might more accurately be described as the river's attempt to reclaim the territory we have so presumptuously built upon it. There is a sort of grand watery comedy to the way the Quad Cities handles these annual visitations. The first indication of the river's intent is not a formal notification, but a quiet, insidious creeping of the dampness into the sublevels of the riverside structures. The river does not rush. It does not come crashing in with the dramatic flare of a disaster movie tidal wave. No, it rises with the steady, inexorable patience of a debtor coming to collect on a long overdue loan. It simply asserts itself inch by inch until the streets are no longer streets, but navigable canals, and the local inhabitants are forced to decide whether to invest in a pair of waders or to simply move their living room furniture to the second floor and await further developments. The local response to this encroachment is a master class in Midwestern pragmatism. One does not panic. Panic is for the coastal people who live in fear of their own weather. Here, we merely sandbag. It is a ritual, a communal exertion of the human spirit against the relentless upward movement of the Mississippi. We gather in the rain, we fill burlap sacks with the local earth, and we build our temporary fortifications with the grim, determined focus of a people who are convinced that if we just stack enough sand in the right configuration, the river will surely realize it has made a social error and retreat to its proper place. It is a futile effort, of course, a grand, soggy, and entirely glorious exercise in futility. But it is our effort, and we take a strange sort of satisfaction in it. I once watched a gentleman in Davenport attempt to navigate his way to a tavern in the midst of a particularly ambitious flood. The street had been converted into a temporary murky bayou, and the gentleman, rather than admitting defeat and retreating to the comfort of his own parlor, had instead procured a small battered aluminum boat. He paddled his way down the thoroughfare with the solemnity of a man heading to the office, dodging the floating debris of the local refuse bins and occasionally nodding a greeting to the residents who were watching from their second-story windows. It was a sight of such perfect, unadulterated absurdity that I could not help but be moved. Here was a man who refused to allow a mere act of God to interfere with his plans for a pint, and he was doing so with the quiet, stubborn grace that is the hallmark of the River Valley resident. The flood also provides an opportunity for the local government to engage in its favorite pastime, the issuance of official statements that manage to convey absolutely nothing while sounding remarkably authoritative. We are told to remain vigilant. We are told to monitor the gauge. We are told that the water levels are expected to fluctuate, which is a polite way of saying that the river is doing exactly what it pleases, and that the city council is currently standing on the shore with their hands in their pockets, hoping that the sandbags hold. It is a performance of municipal competency that is truly a joy to behold. It turns the entire region into a sort of grand soggy theater, where the main event is the slow rhythmic rising of the water, and the supporting cast is a collection of officials who are desperately trying to convince the public that they have a plan, when in fact the only plan is to wait for the river to get bored and go home. But the real underlying truth of the flood is that it humbles us. We are a people who pride ourselves on our industry, on our bridges, and on our ability to turn rocks into flying machines and mud into plows. We think we have tamed the land. We think we have imposed our order upon the landscape. And then the Mississippi, that grand, ancient, and entirely indifferent force of nature, decides that it wants to pay us a visit. It flows into our basements, it carpets our parks in a thick layer of silt, and it reminds us that we are merely squatters on the floodplain. It is a reminder that for all our talk of Silicon Valleys and industrial hubs, we are ultimately subject to the whims of the river that gave us our start. There is a whimsical, almost mischievous quality to the flood's reach. It chooses to visit the most inconvenient places. It finds the one basement that has been freshly finished, the one storefront that has just been stocked with high-end merchandise, and the one park that is home to the most elaborate collection of heavy-duty, industrial-themed sculpture. It is as if the river has a sense of humor, a cold, watery, and entirely relentless wit that is directed squarely at the pride of the local citizenry. It takes our careful, orderly plans and it saturates them in brown, sediment-heavy water until they lose all semblance of utility. And yet, we don't hate the river for it. We view it with a kind of wary, grudging respect. We know that the river provides, and we know that the river takes, and we have accepted this as the price of doing business in the Quad Cities. When the water finally begins to recede, the cleanup begins. This is another ritual entirely, a communal stripping away of the mud, a scrubbing of the streets, and a collective assessment of the damage. We return to our homes, we drag the waterlogged debris to the curb, and we dry out the rugs and repair the walls. We do it without complaint, because we are the people who stayed when the river came to call. We have a shared, muddy history that bonds us, a sense of having survived a common, watery ordeal that the people in the highlands will never understand. We are the survivors of the flood, and we wear our soggy, silt-stained memories with a sort of quiet, understated pride. There is, I suspect, something fundamentally honest about a city that allows its downtown to be periodically reclaimed by the water. It prevents us from becoming too self-important. It keeps us from believing our own press releases about being the center of the industrial world. It keeps us connected to the reality of the river, to the reality of the earth, and to the reality of our own small and entirely fragile place in the grand sweeping narrative of the Mississippi. So, when the water rises, do not despair, do not curse the river, and do not blame the city planners, and for heaven's sake, do not attempt to fight the Mississippi with anything less than a very large supply of burlap and a very positive attitude. Instead, find a pair of high boots, go down to the riverfront, and watch the water as it makes its way through the streets. Watch it as it curls around the lampposts and ripples against the storefronts, and try to appreciate the sight of your city being transformed into a temporary, watery kingdom. It is a grand, slow-motion farce, a reminder of the scale of our existence, and a testament to our stubborn, persistent, and entirely inexplicable need to keep on building, keep on working, and keep on eating our pizza right here on the very edge of the great brown current that has seen it all before. It is, in its own soggy way, the most honest experience in the Quad Cities. And if you haven't lived through a flood, you haven't truly earned the right to call yourself a resident of this Valley of the River Kings. Chapter 15. The Bix 7 Marathon of Madness. If one were to construct a cathedral to the folly of human ambition, one might choose to build it out of discarded running shoes, stained with the dust of a dozen races, and smelling faintly of the desire to be somewhere else faster. We have already established that the inhabitants of these river-swept cities are a people prone to the occasional, profound lapse in the exercise of common sense. We have our taco pizza tragedies, our 5-city naming conventions, and our bridges that serve primarily as stationary observation decks for the contemplation of gridlock. But it is in the annual Bix 7 race that we achieve the absolute zenith of our civic absurdity. We have decided, in a fit of collective panting and entirely unmusical enthusiasm, that the best way to honor a man who spent his life playing the cornet in the smoky, dimly lit, and profoundly sedentary atmosphere of the jazz club is to force several thousand of his fellow citizens to run 7 miles through the mid-July furnace of a Davenport morning. I have pondered this ritual at length, and the more I consider it, the more I am convinced that Bix Beiderbecke, could he be reached by the medium of a telegraph, or perhaps a particularly persistent medium, would find the entire affair to be a joke of a caliber that even he, in his most creative, riff-exploring moods, would struggle to match. Bix was a man of the night. He was a man who understood that the true beauty of life is found in the spaces between the notes, and that a soul is best nurtured by a glass of something cool, a chair that does not demand you stand, and a melody that drifts through the air like a ghost. To suggest that his memory might be best served by a stampede of sweaty, lycra-clad enthusiasts competing to see who can reach the finish line first while the sun beats down with the unforgiving malice of a desert furnace is a suggestion so magnificently removed from reality that it deserves a prize of its own. And yet, there they are, thousands of them. They arrive before the sun has had the decency to clear the horizon, shivering in their shorts and preparing their bodies for an ordeal that they have paid for the privilege of suffering. There is a palpable, frantic energy in the air, a sort of pre-race electricity that has nothing to do with jazz and everything to do with the human desire to prove that we are capable of enduring unnecessary discomfort for the sake of a plastic medal and a sense of shared communal suffering. They stretch their calves with the intensity of men preparing to fight a dragon. They bounce on their toes, and they eye one another with the guarded competitive suspicion of athletes who know that the real enemy is not the other runner, but the humidity, which is currently clinging to the streets of Davenport like a wet woolen blanket. The race begins with a gunshot, an ironic, percussive opening to a tribute for a man who preferred the smooth, fluid improvisation of the cornet. Then the stampede commences. It is a sight that would bewilder the founders of this fair city. Here are the lawyers, the factory floor foremen, the school teachers, and the insurance salesmen, all of them forgetting the indignities of their daily lives to participate in this grand, rhythmic, and entirely pointless pilgrimage. They run past the houses, they run past the churches, they run past the taverns that are, quite sensibly, still locked tight against the madness of the hour. They run with the pained, determined expressions of people who are trying to outrun their own mortality, or perhaps just trying to reach the finish line before they pass out from the sheer, overwhelming effort of being a big sight. There is a distinct rhythmic thumping that defines the race, the sound of 10,000 feet hitting the pavement, a beat that is entirely devoid of syncopation, entirely lacking in soul, and entirely brutally predictable. It is the antithesis of jazz. It is the sound of the machine. It is the sound of a city that has decided that if we cannot play the cornet like Bix, we shall at least prove that we have the stamina to survive the heat in his name. And if the irony of this, that we are honoring an improviser by performing the most mechanical, repetitive, and monotonous physical action known to man, is lost on the runners, it is not lost on the spectators who line the streets, cheering them on with the confused, encouraging enthusiasm of a public that is mostly just happy to be out of the house. One finds, upon observing the race from the shade of a Davenport porch, that there is a whimsical, beautiful, and fundamentally human element to the spectacle. We are, at our core, a species that enjoys the collective struggle. We like the idea that we can gather as a tribe to perform a deed that makes no sense, provided we do it together. We like the idea that we can turn the streets of our city into a track, and that we can imbue the act of running with a sort of quasi-spiritual commemorative significance. It is a tribal dance, performed in the heat of summer. And if it has nothing to do with jazz, well, perhaps that is for the best. Bix belongs to the night, and the night is for the music. The day, it seems, belongs to the marathoners, and they have claimed it with a frantic, sweating, and entirely earnest devotion. The race itself is a tour of the city's most challenging topography. Davenport, in its infinite hilly wisdom, decided that the best way to test the mettle of a runner was to make them climb the inclines that seemed to go on for an eternity, rising toward the sky like the expectations of a young man who has just been told he is destined for greatness. The runners hit the hills, they slow, they wheeze, and they look at the summit with hollow, desperate eyes of people who have come to the realization that they were never really destined for anything other than a very sore set of hamstrings. It is here that the jazz begins to play, or rather, here that the bands, having been stationed at the most grueling, soul-crushing portions of the route, begin to wail. It is a charming, chaotic contrast. A runner nearing the point of collapse hits the crest of a hill and is greeted by a Dixieland band that is blaring a tune so bright, so fast, and so relentlessly optimistic that the runner has no choice but to keep moving. The music pushes them forward. The music acts as a sort of frantic, high-pitched, and entirely unsolicited personal trainer. It is the Bic spirit, reborn as a brass-heavy motivator. And in those moments, as the runner finds the energy to take the next step, one can almost believe that Bix is watching from the clouds, shaking his head at the lunacy of it all, but finding, perhaps, a glimmer of respect for the sheer, stubborn, and entirely ridiculous dedication of the crowd. When the race ends, the city is a scene of organized post-exertion recovery. The runners collapse onto the grass, they drink their water, they wear their medals with the solemn pride of soldiers returning from a campaign, and they look at one another with the shared silent acknowledgement that they have survived. They have completed the Bix 7. They have run the miles. They have endured the hills, and they have survived the heat. They are the heroes of the morning, the champions of the corridor, the sweaty, triumphant, and entirely exhausted custodians of the memory of a man who would have likely been horrified by the entire endeavor. I find that I have a grudging, growing, and entirely sincere affection for the madness of it. We are a people who do not do things by halves. If we are going to honor a jazzman, we are not going to hold a quiet, contemplative concert. We are going to close the streets, mobilize the city, and run ourselves into a state of temporary, physical oblivion. It is our way of saying that we are here, that we are alive, and that we are capable of turning even the most sensible, quiet, and soulful of legacies into a high-energy, midsummer, pavement-pounding, and entirely hilarious tribute. So, let the runners run. Let the bands play their frantic, joyful notes. Let the Davenport Hills continue to be the graveyard of ambition and the testing ground of the weary. We are the Bix 7, and we are the people who have decided that if life is a song, then we shall play it as loudly, as rhythmically, and as physically as we possibly can. It is a grand, whimsical, and fundamentally absurd performance, and I, for one, would not miss it for the world. After all, if Bix were here, I suspect he would be the first one to suggest that after the race, after the sweat has cooled and the medals have been awarded, there is only one way to truly finish the day, by finding the darkest, quietest tavern in the district, pulling up a chair, and listening to the music as it was meant to be heard, sitting down in the cool of the evening, far away from the sun, the pavement, and the ridiculous, wonderful madness of the morning marathon. Chapter 16. The Factory Floor Cold War. If you desire to know the true character of a man in the Quad Cities, do not ask him where he worships on a Sunday, nor for whom he casts his ballot when the autumn winds turn the cornfields to brittle gold. Those are matters of private conscience, or perhaps of habit, and carry little weight in the serious business of social stratification. No, if you wish to gauge the very marrow of his soul, you must ask him a question of far greater consequence. What shade of green do you have running in your veins? It is a subtle inquiry, fraught with the danger of a diplomatic incident, for we live in a region where the allegiance to one's tractor brand is not merely a matter of mechanical preference, it is a creed. We have spent the better part of a century locked in a cold war of the factory floor, a conflict fought not with missiles or treaties, but with attachments, hydraulic systems, and the steadfast refusal to acknowledge that any machine painted in a rival hue could possibly be worth the metal it was cast from. It is a regional obsession that provides the steady underlying hum of our local discourse, a tribalism that is as persistent as the river current and twice as stubborn. To the uninitiated observer, the poor, lost soul from the East who thinks a tractor is simply a tractor, much as he might think a horse is simply a horse, this fervor is entirely baffling. He sees a machine that pulls a plow, a machine that cuts the hay, a machine that manages the chores of the field, and he assumes they are all brothers under the hood. He has not yet learned that in our valley a machine is not an object. It is an identity. To favor the iconic vibrant green and yellow is to signal your belief in a particular vision of the world, a world of established, reliable, and deeply traditional agricultural might. To favor the bold, defiant red of the rival manufacturer is to signal your belief in a different set of virtues, a leaner, hungrier, and perhaps more modern approach to the taming of the prairie. The conflict manifests itself in the most delightful and entirely irrational ways. I have attended neighborhood barbecues where the guests were subtly segregated by the color of the equipment they parked in their barns. The John Deere men would stand in one corner of the yard discussing the finer points of seed density, while the Case 1H men would congregate on the porch, their voices pitched in a low conspiratorial register as they weighed the merits of their own torque-heavy beasts. They were not enemies. They would pull one another out of a ditch in the dead of winter without a second's hesitation. But they were members of different ecclesiastical orders, each convinced that the other was laboring under a minor yet fundamentally fatal misunderstanding of the laws of mechanical physics. The factory floor itself, in the great roaring temples of industry that define our local skyline, is the site of this ongoing, unspoken struggle. There is a pride in the work that goes beyond the paycheck. The man who spends his days tightening the bolts on a combine harvester is not just assembling a machine. He is defending the honor of his chosen hue. He views the rival factory down the road with a mixture of professional respect and deep, abiding suspicion, much like the knight who respects the skill of his opponent on the field, but who would rather be caught dead than be seen wearing the colors of his opponent's house. It is a loyalty that is both touching and profoundly, laughably ridiculous. It is the sort of thing that gives the Quad Cities its peculiar industrial strength backbone. I once spent an afternoon in a local tavern, a neutral zone, thank the heavens, where a group of retired factory hands were debating the history of the tractor as if it were the history of the Roman Empire. They spoke of the legendary models of the mid-century with the hushed, reverent tones of scholars discussing the lost scrolls of antiquity. "The 4020," one man whispered, his eyes distant as if looking back at the glory of a lost age. "That was a machine that could pull the sun out of the sky if you gave it the right attachment." A man from the rival camp scoffed to sound like gravel shifting in a bin. "The 4020? A fine piece of machinery, I suppose, if you enjoyed spending your weekends under the hood with a set of wrenches. Now, if you wanted a machine that would run until the end of time, you were looking for the 1066. And off they went, deeper into the thicket of mechanical minutia, debating the virtues of diesel combustion, the reliability of transmissions, and the enduring, soulful quality of a particular brand of iron. It was a comedy of high-stakes pedantry, a symphony of industrial lore. They were not really arguing about tractors, of course. They were arguing about the shape of their lives. They were arguing about the work they had done, the machines they had tended, and the loyalty they had pledged to the companies that had provided the rhythm of their days. It was an argument about home. It was an argument about the identity of the valley itself. There is a whimsical sort of patriotism in this, I think. We are a people who want to believe that we are part of something bigger than ourselves, something that carries on even when we have put down our tools and retired to the porch. We want to believe that the green or the red represents a continuity of purpose, a standard that we have raised and carried through the changing seasons of the market and the technology. And if that means we have to indulge in a bit of tribal posturing, if it means we have to roll our eyes at the sight of a neighbor's choice of harvest equipment, then that is a small, entirely human price to pay. We are a people who have built our lives around the tools of our trade, and we have the right to be a little bit stubborn about the color of the paint. Of course, the march of the modern era threatens this colorful schism. We are seeing the rise of the high-tech, the automated, and the subscription-based, where the soul of the machine is increasingly hidden behind a curtain of proprietary code. The tractors of tomorrow are beginning to look less like distinct, rival empires and more like identical, cloud-connected mobile servers that just happen to come with a different logo on the side. It is a terrifying prospect for the old guard. They look at these new computer-governed giants, and they wonder where the iron is, where the grit is, and where the room is for a man to exert his own mechanical judgment. They fear that the Cold War of the factory floor is coming to an end, not with a bang, but with a software update. But even as the technology shifts, even as the nature of the labor changes, the pride remains. Whether you are driving a piece of hardware that can map the soil to the millimeter, or sitting atop a restored classic that rattles your teeth with every revolution of the engine, the attachment to the machine is real. It is the stubborn, persistent refusal to be a mere consumer and the desire to be a participant in the work of the valley. We are the people of the furrow and the factory, and as long as there is ground to be turned and iron to be cast, there will be someone here arguing that their way of doing it and their color of choice is the only way that makes a lick of sense. So let the world continue its march toward the digital and the standardized. Let the observers from the outside look at our rivalries and wonder why we can't all just get along, or why we can't all just agree that a tractor is a tool for the harvest. We shall continue to paint our colors on the horizon. We shall continue to debate the finer points of the engine at the local diner. We shall continue to be the valley that takes its iron as seriously as its soul. It is a grand, whimsical, and entirely, stubbornly industrial comedy, and as long as the tractors are running and the debate is still hot, the Quad Cities will be exactly where they have always been, right in the middle of a struggle that is both fundamentally unimportant and, in its own way, the most important thing in the world. And if anyone dares to tell you that the red is better than the green, or that the green is anything less than the gold standard, you just tell them to keep their opinions to themselves until they've spent a day in the field, and then, and only then, will you consider listening to their nonsense. Chapter 17. The Mystery of East Moline. If you ever wish to witness a geographic vanishing act that would make a seasoned illusionist weep with professional envy, I suggest you take a tour of the region and ask a local to point out the city of East Moline. You will receive in response a look of such profound, lingering, and utterly polite confusion that you might begin to doubt the evidence of your own eyes. The local will squint at the horizon, he will consult the mental map he keeps of the Quad Cities, and he will eventually settle on a look of mild apologetic shrug, as if to say, well, it is technically there, I suppose, but we don't really count it, do we? It is the great, unspoken, and entirely delightful mystery of our five-city region. The city that everyone knows exists, but that nobody, not the newspapers, not the politicians, and certainly not the residents of the other four municipalities, can quite bring themselves to acknowledge as a full-fledged member of the club. East Moline is the phantom limb of the Quad Cities. It is the city that does the heavy lifting, the city that possesses the factories, the city that has contributed its share of industrial grit and hard-earned tax revenue to the collective prosperity of the valley, and yet it is treated with the distant, vague familiarity usually reserved for a second cousin who shows up uninvited to the annual reunion. You ask a man in Davenport where he is going, and he will tell you he is heading to Rock Island or Moline. You ask a man in Bettendorf where he shops, and he will tell you he is going to the malls of the larger cities. But no one, not since the dawn of the Tri-City Delusion, has ever proudly proclaimed that they were heading out for a night on the town in East Moline. It is a city that exists in a state of permanent industrial stealth. The mystery of East Moline is not, of course, a mystery of the supernatural sort. It is a mystery of the social sort. It is the result of a long, sustained campaign of civic neglect, aided and abetted by the fact that East Moline had the misfortune of being added to the region at a time when the name Tri-City had already become so deeply entrenched in the local psyche that any suggestion of adding a fourth or fifth moniker was treated as a dangerous, radical, and fundamentally unneighborly act of arithmetic. To recognize East Moline as a city would have been to admit that the Tri was a lie, and if there is one thing we Quad Cityans value above all else, it is the comfort of a lie that has been repeated often enough to sound like the truth. One might suspect that the residents of East Moline would be incensed by this state of affairs, that they would march across the border in a righteous, city-identifying fury, demanding their seat at the municipal table and their name on the local mastheads. But that is to misunderstand the character of the place. East Moline is a city of quiet, rugged, and profoundly unpretentious industry. It does not demand the spotlight. It does not feel the need to construct grand hotels or host jazz festivals or build soaring bridges that congest the morning commute. It simply gets on with the work. It is the place where the heavy lifting happens, the place where the machinery is built, the place where the actual sweat-drenched, blue-collared business of keeping the valley afloat takes place. It is the engine room of the Quad Cities, and like all good engine rooms, it is content to remain below deck, ignored by the passengers who are too busy looking at the scenery to realize who is actually keeping the vessel moving. I find this quality to be quite admirable in its own gritty and entirely ignored way. There is a dignity to being the city that everyone forgets to count. It allows East Moline to exist without the pressure of having to perform for the tourists, without the need to maintain an image of quad perfection, and without the constant gnawing anxiety of whether it is wicked enough or historic enough or prosperous enough to be invited to the inner circles of the local establishment. East Moline is the city that just is. It is the city that understands that the real, honest, and fundamentally important work of the world is rarely performed in the limelight. And yet, there is a certain unmistakable humor in the way we treat it. We drive past the signs that clearly state entering East Moline, and we act as if we have simply crossed a threshold into an alternate, slightly less fashionable dimension. We look out the windows at the factories and the homes and the bustling, hard-working streets, and we think to ourselves, ah, yes, East Moline, the city that time, or at least the census takers, forgot. We treat it with the same gentle and entirely misplaced condescension that one might offer to a very reliable, very hard-working mule. We know the mule is essential, we know the mule is strong, and we know the mule is doing the work that none of us would be capable of performing, but we would never dream of bringing the mule inside the house to have dinner with the guests. There is a story, or perhaps it is a myth, for it has the sort of ring of truth that usually accompanies a good regional tall tale, that once, in the early days of the 20th century, a group of East Moline citizens decided to organize a parade to proclaim their existence. They marched, they waved their flags, they played their drums, and they made a truly impressive amount of noise. But, as the story goes, the parade was so singularly focused on the act of existence that they forgot to include any spectators from the other cities. The people of Davenport and Rock Island, busy with their own affairs, didn't even notice the commotion. The parade marched from one end of East Moline to the other, celebrated its own existence with a truly heroic amount of enthusiasm, and then disbanded, having successfully proven that if you want to be recognized in the Quad Cities, you are better off just getting back to work. It is a tragedy, really, if you have a mind for the dramatic, but I suspect it is a comedy if you have a mind for the whimsical. East Moline is the ultimate punchline of the regional joke. It is the city that proves that identity is not what you are, but what you can convince your neighbors to believe you are. And since East Moline has never been particularly bothered by the opinion of its neighbors, it has managed to maintain a sort of civic peace that is entirely unavailable to the other four cities. It is the most content city in the valley, precisely because it has accepted its fate as the invisible, essential, and entirely unacknowledged partner in the great Quad Cities experiment. So, the next time you find yourself traveling through our sideways flowing, bridge-crossed, malt-crusted patch of the world, take a moment to look at the signage. When you see the sign that marks the border of East Moline, give it a respectful nod. Recognize it for what it is, the city that keeps the lights on, the factories running, and the whole ridiculous five-city pretending to be four charade in operation. Recognize it as the place that does the work while the rest of us are busy arguing about whether we are a tri-city or a quad or a quint. Recognize it as the true, silent, and fundamentally important heart of the valley. And then continue on your way. And if anyone asks you how many cities we have, you might just tell them that it is a matter of profound, regional, and entirely unanswerable mystery, and that you find it to be much more entertaining that way. It is a grand, beautiful, and fundamentally American way to live, to be ignored, to be essential, and to be entirely comfortable in your own unacknowledged skin. It is the mystery of East Moline, and it is, quite frankly, my favorite part of the local show. Chapter 18, The Ballpark of Perpetual Hope. If you are a student of the human condition, you must eventually come to realize that there is no more accurate barometer of a community's soul than its baseball stadium. It is a place of profound ritualized optimism, a sanctuary where we gather to engage in the deeply irrational act of hoping that this year the boys in the home uniform will finally manage to hit the ball with more consistency than they did the year before. In our little river valley, this sacred ground is modern Woodman Park, a venue that has weathered the floods, the whims of the minor league gods, and the unrelenting sideways flowing current of the Mississippi to become the definitive heart of our summer entertainment. It is a ballpark that occupies the sort of prime real estate usually reserved for luxury condominiums or gated estates, a patch of ground so close to the river that should a home run be struck with sufficient heroic violence, it is theoretically possible to deposit the ball directly into the waiting currents of the Mississippi. It is a venue that sits in the shadow of the bridge, a reminder that while the traffic above may be a purgatory of gridlock and frustration, the game below is a paradise of peanuts, cold lager, and the cheering of the faithful. It is the place where the Quad Cities goes to pretend that the factory floor and the office cubicle do not exist, and that the most important question in the world is not the quarterly production report, but whether the runner on second can beat the throw to home. The history of the park is a history of our own regional stubbornness. We have built stadiums, we have seen them age, and we have, in a fit of architectural ambition, decided that we would rather renovate the soul out of the old ones than settle for the sterile, prefabricated replacements that have become the standard in the rest of the country. Modern Woodman Park is the product of that stubbornness, a structure that feels less like a corporate stadium and more like a collection of stands and bleachers that have grown organically out of the riverbank. It has the distinct, unmistakable scent of tradition, the smell of hot dogs, the grass, and the faint underlying perfume of the river that, every few years, decides to remind the groundskeeper that the park is, in point of fact, a floodplain. I have spent many hours in those stands, and I have come to believe that the true allure of the park is not the game itself, but the sense of connection it fosters. When you are sitting in the bleachers, looking out over the field and the river beyond, you are not merely a consumer of entertainment. You are a participant in a ritual. You are sitting next to a man who might disagree with you on the subject of the I-74 bridge, and a woman who might be your rival in the industry of agricultural machinery, but for the duration of the 9 innings, you are united by the common, desperate, and entirely illogical hope that the next pitch will be a strike. It is a democratic experience. It is the only place in the valley where the status of the quad is irrelevant, and the only thing that matters is the scoreboard. And the Ferris wheel. Oh, to behold the Ferris wheel that looms over the outfield, a great rotating circle of childhood wonder that seems entirely out of place in a stadium that is otherwise dedicated to the serious, dusty, and fundamentally melancholic business of the minor leagues. It is a whimsical touch, a bit of carnival magic that tells you everything you need to know about our regional philosophy. We believe that baseball is a serious endeavor, but we also believe that it should be accompanied by the opportunity to view the river from the height of a rotating, glowing, and entirely dizzying machine. It is a landmark of the local skyline, a beacon for the fans who are lost in the traffic on the bridge, and a reminder that in the Quad Cities, Even our stadiums are meant to be a bit ridiculous. But there is a melancholy to the ballpark as well. It is a place that marks the passage of time. You look at the players, those young men with their dreams of the big leagues and their bright, optimistic futures, and you realize that they are the transients of our valley. They come, they play, they provide us with a summer of memories, and then they vanish into the wider world, leaving behind nothing but the faded statistics in the program and the lingering scent of popcorn. It is the rhythm of the season, a cycle of arrival and departure that mirrors our own Midwestern life. We build, we play, we watch, and we let go, always waiting for the next spring, always waiting for the snow to melt, and always waiting for the team to return to the field. Modern Woodman Park is also the site of our most spectacular failures to master the elements. I have seen games delayed by the sudden, torrential downpours that turn the outfield into a lake, and I have seen games called on account of the river deciding to reclaim the diamond. It is the only ballpark in the country where the manager has to be as concerned with the hydrodynamics of the river as he is with the pitching rotation. We have, over the years, treated the field with the sort of reverence one usually reserves for a religious site, and yet the river continues to offer its unsolicited watery critique of our efforts. We sandbag the dugouts, we tarp the infield, and we pray to the gods of the weather, all in the name of playing 3 hours of baseball before the humidity forces us to return to our homes. If you ever wish to understand the heart of the Quad Cities, you must spend a night at the ballpark. You must sit in the stands, you must listen to the crack of the bat against the ball, and you must look out over the river as the lights of the bridge begin to shimmer on the surface of the water. You must observe the crowd, the families, the fans, the river watchers, and the occasional deeply confused tourist who is wondering why there is a Ferris wheel in the middle of a baseball field. You must understand that this is not just a game. It is an act of defiance against the mundane. It is our way of saying that even in a world of factories and bridges and confusing city counts, we can still gather, we can still hope, and we can still, for a few hours, pretend that the most important thing in the world is whether the runner makes it to third base. It is a grand, whimsical, and fundamentally American comedy, and as long as the lights are burning and the game is on and the river is rolling past, modern Woodman Park will continue to be the place where we go to remind ourselves that we are not just citizens of a region, but members of a community. We are the watchers of the game, the riders of the wheel, and the residents of the valley that is perpetually, hopefully, and entirely beautifully waiting for the bottom of the ninth. It is the ballpark of perpetual hope, and I, for one, would not trade our muddy, river-threatened, Ferris wheel-dominated field for all the manicured, sterile, and entirely boring stadiums in the rest of the land. It is the perfect, local, and entirely stubbornly Quad-Citian way to spend a summer evening, and it is exactly as ridiculous, as passionate, and as honest as it needs to be. Chapter 19. The Great Rivers in Different Geography. If you take a map of these United States and unfold it with the care of a man handling a delicate, long-neglected legal document, you will eventually find your way to that broad, muddy artery of the continent known as the Mississippi. It is a noble stream, a river of immense history and even greater vanity, but in the vicinity of the Quad Cities, it decides to abandon the north-to-south protocol that it has so dutifully followed since its inception in the chilly, uncomplaining woods of Minnesota. Upon arriving at our doorstep, it pauses, takes a long, reflective look at the horizon, and decides that it would much rather spend its afternoon flowing from east to west. This geographic whim, a sudden horizontal shuffle, has been the source of profound systemic confusion for every mapmaker, river pilot, and municipal planner who has had the misfortune to attempt a logical categorization of the region. It is the reason why, when you ask a local for directions, you are liable to receive a response that begins with a meditative silence and ends with a series of instructions so complex they would require a compass, a sextant, and a high degree of faith in the existence of an afterlife. We do not have north or south here. We have toward the river and away from the river. And heaven help the stranger who attempts to apply the standard cardinal directions to a city that has decided to ignore the fundamental laws of cartographic north. The river, in its infinite watery indifference, does not care about our city limits. It does not care about our tax districts, our school boundaries, or our municipal rivalries. It simply rolls on, a massive, brown, and perpetually shifting force that views our bridges, our factories, and our carefully constructed piles of sandbags as so many temporary inconveniences. It is the true landlord of the valley, and we are merely the tenants who have built our lives upon the floodplain, hoping that the river is in a sufficiently good mood to allow us to remain here for another decade or two. I once knew an old river captain, a man whose skin had been cured by the sun and the spray until it resembled a piece of well-worn saddle leather, who told me that the Mississippi has a memory. He claimed that every time it overflows its banks, it is merely checking to see if we have built anything new that needs to be washed away, much like a man checking to see if his neighbor has left any tools lying out in the rain. He spoke of the river as if it were a sentient, brooding giant that watched us from beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when we became too confident, too settled, and too convinced of our own importance. It is a superstitious notion, no doubt, but in a valley where the river dictates the very shape of the streets and the very nature of the commute, it is a notion that finds a surprising amount of purchase in the local imagination. There is a grand, whimsical beauty in the way our cities have arranged themselves around this sideways flowing giant. We are a collection of settlements that have clung to the bluffs and the banks like barnacles on the hull of a great drifting ship. We have oriented our lives toward the water, yet we are fundamentally suspicious of its power. We build our parks upon the very soil that the river intends to reclaim in the spring, and then we act shocked, truly deeply shocked, when the water arrives to take back the grass. It is a comedy of errors, played out on a regional scale, and we are the only participants who seem to be unaware that the joke is entirely on us. Consider the bridges, those spindly, iron-limbed intercessors that allow us to cross the river without having to commit ourselves to the vagaries of the ferry. They are the symbols of our regional defiance. They are our way of saying, "Very well, river, you may flow where you wish, and you may shuffle from east to west with all the aquatic arrogance you can muster, but we shall bridge you, we shall span you, and we shall insist on driving our commuters across your back until they are late for work." The river, in turn, seems to tolerate the bridges with a sort of cold, watery disdain, shaking its currents against the piers and waiting, with the patience of an epoch, for the moment when the steel will finally surrender to the rust and the flood. The geography of the Quad Cities is, in essence, a geography of contradiction. We are a river valley that spends most of its time pretending to be an industrial heartland. We are a collection of municipalities that insist on counting to 5 while calling ourselves a 4. We are a community that lives in a state of permanent, bridge-induced anxiety, yet we cling to our riverside homes with a tenacity that defies all rational explanation. We have made ourselves a place that exists outside the standard laws of the compass, a patch of the map where the directions shift according to the current, and where the most reliable way to get from one side of the river to the other is to simply accept that you are going to be stuck in traffic for a very long time. There is an intelligent sort of despair in the way we map our lives. We know the river is the boss. We know that the river will have the final word in any argument concerning the permanence of our infrastructure, and yet we continue to build. We continue to improve. We continue to invent our taco pizzas and our industrial scrap metal statues as if the sheer accumulated weight of our regional eccentricity might somehow pin the river into place. We are a people of the construction, not the conclusion. We are the builders of the temporary, the designers of the adjustment, and the architects of the bridge that is always just a little bit behind the demands of the traffic. And if you ask me, that is the most human, the most intelligent, and the most fundamentally whimsical way to inhabit a landscape. We are not meant to master the geography. We are meant to participate in it. We are meant to live alongside the river, to respect its sideways shuffle, to laugh at the confusion of the commuters, and to accept that the map of the Quad Cities will never truly be complete, because the river is always working on a new draft. So, traveler, do not look for the north, and do not worry if your compass seems to be spinning with the frustration of a man trying to calculate the tax levy of East Moline. You are in the valley of the River Kings, where the water flows at its own pace, and the geography is a matter of collective and entirely flexible agreement. You are in a place where the map is merely a suggestion, and where the most important instruction is the one that tells you to watch the current, pay attention to the traffic, and never, under any circumstances, assume that you know exactly which way is up. It is a grand, flowing, and entirely irrational landscape. And if you can learn to love the confusion, you will find that it is, in its own way, the most beautiful place in the entire, winding, and perpetually undecided American West. And if you happen to find a street that leads you to the water, do not be surprised if it is a street that was never meant to be there. The river, after all, is a persistent tenant, and it has a way of redesigning the city according to its own watery architecture whenever we aren't looking. It is a grand, slow motion, and entirely aquatic conspiracy, and we are, quite happily, the ones who get to pay the bridge toll. Chapter 20, The Final Furrow. We conclude our rambling, river-soaked survey with a toast to a region that remains stubbornly, perfectly itself, a place where you can find a world-class jet engine part being machined in the morning and a shredded malt crust taco pizza being consumed in the evening, and be perfectly content with the contradiction. It is a land that does not care to be understood by the standards of the coastal elites or the button-down logic of the big city planners. It is a place that defines itself not by what it has achieved in the sterile halls of academia, but by what it has survived, what it has built with its own calloused, grease-stained hands, and what it has continued to endure with a wry Midwestern smile that suggests It knows a secret the rest of the world has forgotten. We are a collection of riverbanked municipalities that are perpetually caught in a dance between the heavy, ironclad past and the light, digital future. We are the builders of the massive iron implements that carve the prairie into a garden, and we are the dreamers of the airy, lightweight futures that take flight from our own riverfront foundries. We are a people of the bridge and the boulevard, a people of the muddy current and the paved-over floodplain, and we have learned through the long, slow, and often frustrating process of living here that the most important thing is not to be consistent. It is to be present. We are here when the river rises. We are here when the shift whistle blows, and we are here when the sun sets over the great, sideways flowing Mississippi, casting long purple shadows over the silos and the spires that mark our place in the world. There is a profound, if somewhat dusty, wisdom in this. We are a people who have learned that the world is a malleable place. We have learned that the way things are is not necessarily the way they have to be. If the bread can be sliced, why not slice it? If the pizza can be topped with a salad, why not top it? If the river can be spanned with a bridge that costs a king's ransom and takes a generation to build, then by all means, let us span it, and let us argue about the result for the next 100 years. It is an outlook that is entirely, vibrantly, and aggressively American. It is the spirit of the tinkerer, the spirit of the inventor, and the spirit of the man who looks at a perfectly good morning and decides that it would be better if he spent it in the shop taking apart the lawnmower just to see how it works. If there is a final lesson to be drawn from our little experiment in regional existence, it is this: that you are not defined by the borders you draw, but by the work you do. You are defined by the iron you cast, the corn you harvest, the jazz you play, and the strange, inexplicable, and entirely wonderful pizza you serve to your neighbors on a Friday night. You are defined by your ability to keep moving, even when the commute is stalled on the Power 74 bridge, even when the river is rising into the basement, and even when the rest of the world has stopped counting your cities and started wondering why you are still there, laboring away in the middle of the continent, forging your own future one rivet, one riff, and one furrow at a time. It has been a grand, whimsical, and entirely beautifully flawed narrative. We have wandered from the pizza parlors to the factory floors, from the river purgatory of the bridge to the dusty metallic history of the park sculptures, and through it all, one thing has remained constant: the stubborn, unyielding, and entirely gloriously Quad-Citian insistence that we are a place apart. We are the Valley of the River Kings. We are the Silicon Valley of the Trigger. We are the home of the taco pizza and the heart of the heartland, and we are, quite simply, the only place where you can be perfectly, comfortably, and entirely yourself. Even if you are having a devil of a time explaining to your guests why you are currently living in a city that officially counts as 4, is commonly referred to as 3, and is secretly proud of being at least 5. We are a community that lives in a state of permanent bridge-induced anxiety, yet we cling to our riverside homes with a tenacity that defies all rational explanation. We have made ourselves a place that exists outside the standard laws of the compass, a patch of the map where the directions shift according to the current, and where the most reliable way to get from one side of the river to the other is to simply accept that you are going to be stuck in traffic for a very long time. And yet, does this not make us more human? Does this not reflect the very nature of existence? We spend our lives building, and then we spend our lives adjusting what we have built. We are the builders of the temporary, the designers of the adjustment, and the architects of the bridge that is always just a little bit behind the demands of the traffic. So, here is to the Quad Cities. Here is to the river that never stops visiting, the factories that never stop humming, and the people who never stop building, even when they know the water is going to come back for another look. It is a place of endless industrial wonder, a place of ironclad ambition, and a place where the future is always just one more adjustment away. I leave you with this final thought. If you ever find yourself adrift in the middle of this great American sprawl, do not worry about the North or the South. Do not worry about the counting or the geometry. Just look for the smokestack. Follow the scent of the malt crust and keep your eyes on the river. It is the only thing that knows the way, and in this valley, that is the only map you will ever truly need. We are at last finished with the furrow, and it is a fine, straight, and entirely honest line that we have plowed together. We have turned the soil, we have planted the seeds of our own peculiar identity, and we have waited for the harvest with the patient, uncomplaining resignation of the farmer who knows that the weather is the only thing that really matters. We have built our houses on the floodplain, we have bridged the waters that divide us, and we have told ourselves a story so long and so loud that we have finally come to believe it. It is a story of grit, and it is a story of oil, and it is a story of the thousands of men and women who have spent their lives in the shadow of the green and yellow, the red and the white, and all the shades in between, keeping the wheels turning and the rows straight. It is a story that in its own way is as profoundly American as the Mississippi itself. We are a people who love a machine that works. We love a thing that we can understand, a thing that we can fix with a wrench, and a thing that pays us back for our labor with a bountiful harvest of experience. And even if we never get the arithmetic right, and even if the traffic never clears, and even if the river continues to visit us in the spring, we will still be here. We will still be here, tending to our machines, slicing our pies, and telling our tales, because we know something the rest of the world has forgotten, that there is a certain unmistakable beauty in being a place that is content to be exactly, stubbornly, and gloriously itself. So, traveler, when you finally take your leave of our river valley, carry with you the memory of a place that is not a finish line, but a process. Carry with you the image of the sunset over the bridge, the sound of the jazz in the distance, and the taste of the malt crust upon your tongue. And remember us not for our bridges or our industries or our confusing city counts, but for our persistence. Remember us as a people who looked at the challenge of the landscape, looked at the demands of the modern world, and decided that we would rather be a bit messy, a bit loud, and a bit behind schedule than to be anything less than ourselves. It has been a grand, slow motion, and entirely aquatic conspiracy, and I, for one, would not have had it any other way. We have finished our turn, we have reached the end of the field, and it is time to put the plow away and listen to the quiet, rolling, and entirely indifferent river as it carries our history toward the sea.